Mr. Menon.
Good morning.
I think good day to you because I believe you're in a different time zone.
I am.
You're welcome in any event. Please begin yours.
I'm grateful for you granting permission to do for me to do this from outside the jurisdiction.
Not at all. We have technology and sometimes it's useful, as it is on this occasion.
Thank you.
Please begin.
In our first opening statement in November 2020, we analyzed the history and politics of undercover policing in Britain, and specifically the formation and early years of the Special Demonstration Squad, the SDS. We did so largely in an evidential vacuum, as the inquiry had only disclosed a limited amount of material by then. Consequently, our analysis was primarily based on our study of publicly available literature produced by academics, journalists, and activists on secret political policing by the police and the security service MI5. In summary, in that opening statement, we made the following assertions. 1, undercover policing in Britain is established by Special Branch in 1968 and institutionalized in subsequent years as a weapon in the arsenal of the state, was fundamentally incompatible with the norms and values of a democratic society. 2, whilst the SDS was very much a part of a tradition of secret political policing dating back centuries, the SDS did mark a departure in that the systemic deployment of officers to infiltrate political groups on a long-term basis had not been done before, with the odd possible exception. 3, the primary objective of the SDS was never to prevent crime or engage in genuine law enforcement. It was always to spy on those perceived to be political opponents of the state or the status quo. It was always to prevent positive social change and allow the established order to thrive. 4, the non-state core participants had been targeted by the police and MI5 because of their politics and their ideas, not because of any engagement in crime, subversion, or public disorder. 5, as a result of the oblique approach that encouraged the SDS to sweep wide and infiltrate groups that were of no threat, as part of a strategy to provide cover for penetrating other groups of interest, everybody was fair game. Hundreds of left-wing, progressive, and community organizations were targeted and reported on by the secret state. The extent of the espionage was staggering. 6, insofar as the period between 1968 and 1982 was marked by an upsurge in unrest, the preponderance of the violence was inflicted by the police on protesters and not vice versa. 7, the SDS was never politically neutral. It had a clear political orientation on the right of the political spectrum. It represented the hard end of the state apparatus, naturally conservative in culture, politics, and outlook, and its officers were politically vetted by Special Branch, so to be. 8, the targets of the SDS were almost exclusively on the left of the political spectrum and were routinely and wrongly labeled as domestic extremists. Any spying on the far right was minimal and very much an afterthought. 9, policing against ethnic minority communities in Britain has always been blighted by an entrenched racism that permeates the culture, ranks, and structures of the police. 10, whilst the SDS was kept secret from the public, it was completely integrated into the established security apparatus of the state, with a strict chain of command through the senior ranks of the police to the highest levels of MI5 and the government. 11, the SDS had more than simply a close working relationship with MI5. It was subordinate to MI5. 12, nobody in policing or government apparently had the slightest concern about the illegality or immorality of what police spies were doing. In the name of law and order, or national security, or the defense of the realm, the SDS was given free rein to engage in intrusive espionage, regardless of the consequences for those targeted or for our democratic norms and values. And finally, 13, There is nothing to suggest that the police and MI5 have learned lessons and moved on, or that the secret state is now subject to proper and rigorous judicial and parliamentary scrutiny and oversight. Now, since that opening statement in November 2020, the inquiry has disclosed a considerable amount of further material. In fact, 272 documents totaling some 3,287 pages of material have been disclosed since December last year, including 43 documents totaling 1,630 pages of material, which were disclosed as recently as February 15th, just a week ago. The inquiry has also held 3 phases of open hearings and 1 phase of closed hearings. Some of the Tranche 1 modules 2B and 2C documents in the recent disclosure in December and January about the role of those in the higher echelons of the police, the Home Office and the Cabinet Office, are particularly revealing. Whilst it is deeply regrettable that we've had so little time to read, consider, and digest all the recent disclosure, and that no live evidence is to be called to explore in greater detail the more interesting, even shocking and unexpected matters raised by some of this disclosure, it is now clear beyond doubt that not only were the assertions we made more than 2 years ago entirely accurate, but secret political policing between 1968 and 1982 was even more extensive, invasive, and uncontrolled than we had asserted in several notable respects. 1, the espionage on an industrial scale in which the SDS engaged was unlawful from the very outset. There was never any lawful justification for the criminal acts of undercover police officers committed in the name of preventing public order. Whilst the inquiry is, we of course accept, bound by Section 2 of the Inquiries Act 2005 that prohibits any determination of criminal or civil liability, the inquiry is not prohibited from reaching robust findings of fact or making strident recommendations from which liability could inevitably be inferred by others. We trust the inquiry will do so, and we trust that the inquiry will not be intimidated by the state core participants into reaching uncritical conclusions and making bland recommendations that change nothing of substance. 2, the real threat to democracy and the nation's safety and well-being were those engaged in unwarranted state espionage against the people, and not those targeted, spied on, or infiltrated by the state. 3, the state's approach to subversion, whether guided by the Maxwell-Fyfe Directive of 1952 or Lord Harris's 1975 definition, was overbroad. It extended way beyond activity that represented a real threat to parliamentary democracy or the security of the nation. It encompassed perfectly lawful and peaceful activity that should have been encouraged and celebrated in a democratic society. Lord Denning's sensible and proportionate definition of subversion, namely that political opinions are only subversive if they contemplate the overthrow of the government by unlawful means, was deliberately ignored. In fact, it is now clear from the recent disclosure that merely being critical of the police or demanding democratic accountability of the police was sufficient to attract the interest of the police and MI5. 4, although there were senior police officers and civil servants at the Home Office, Sir Gerald Hayden Phillips in particular, who recognized and were critical of the dangers of an overbroad approach to subversion, no political action was taken to curb the excesses of the SDS and MI5. And finally, 5, not only did the police fail to target the far right, who were a real and growing threat to public order during the 1970s, and specifically a real and growing threat to ethnic minority communities, but they were also guilty of, on occasion, of active political collaboration with the far right. Obvious examples were the Battle of Lewisham on the 13th of August, 1977, and the killing of Blair Peach by a police officer in Southall on the 23rd of April, 1979, both of which were a direct result of the fascist National Front holding deliberately provocative political events in communities with large ethnic minority populations, during which the police openly sided with the National Front and used brutal and gratuitous violence against anti-racists and anti-fascists. Turning then briefly to the submissions of others, we commend and endorse the detailed closing submissions on behalf of the cooperating group of non-state co-participants. This fully referenced and painstaking analysis of undercover policing is the final damning indictment of the SDS and its covert operations. In the circumstances, we have not sought to replicate the same in our closing submissions. Instead, our approach is more discursive and focuses on the political and ideological reality of undercover policing by the police and MI5 between 1968 and 1982. We also welcome the fact that counsel to the inquiry has been driven to the conclusion by the sheer weight of the available evidence that there is a strong case now for concluding that the Home Office should have disbanded the SDS in 1976 when reviewing its activities and objectives. Whilst we agree, we would go considerably further and say that the SDS should never have been set up in the first place. It was a plainly illegitimate and disproportionate response to what was fundamentally a failure of public order policing, as opposed to a failure of police intelligence at the demonstration against the Vietnam War in London on the 17th of March, 1968. The Metropolitan Police, including its special branch, already had all the necessary tools at its disposal to ensure that similar public disorder did not occur again. The intrusive espionage in which the SDS subsequently engaged was neither necessary for public order policing purposes nor legally justifiable. Detective Chief Inspector Conrad Dixon's fantasy of "give me a dozen men, £500,000 and a free hand" should never have been indulged, either by his superiors in the Metropolitan Police or by politicians and civil servants in government. As we stated in our first opening statement, the lie that the violence at the March 1968 demonstrations was due to a failure of police intelligence was the original sin that led to the establishment and continuation of the Special Demonstration Squad. During Tranche 1 of this inquiry, we represented three individuals: Tariq Ali, Ernie Tate, and Piers Corbyn. Tariq Ali and Piers Corbyn gave evidence to the inquiry. Ernie Tate could not attend for reasons of ill health, but his statement was read into evidence. Sadly, Ernie Tate, who was one of the founding members of the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, passed away in February 2021. His widow, Jess McKenzie, remains engaged with us over the findings and conclusions of the inquiry. In short, there was no lawful policing purpose for spying on Tariq Ali, Ernie Tate, or Piers Corbyn. None of them, nor the organizations in which they were involved, notably the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign and the International Marxist Group, posed a public order threat or were engaged in subversive activity, however defined, or were undermining parliamentary democracy, or were contemplating the overthrow of the government by unlawful means, or were otherwise a danger to the safety and well-being of the nation. Tariq Ali, Ernie Tate, and Piers Corbyn were public political figures who were always open and transparent about their politics. They had nothing to hide. They should never have been targeted by undercover police officers. As Roy Creamer, a former SDS officer, rightly observed in one of his witness statements, these were the days of Tariq Ali, but on the other hand, them being firebrands was not really actionable in any way. What he was saying was perfectly legal. The state co-participants have failed to this day to provide any credible justification for why it was lawful or otherwise permissible to spy on Tariq Ali, Ernie Tate, or Piers Corbyn. Tariq Ali and Piers Corbyn remain politically active today. Are they still under surveillance more than 50 years after registry files were first opened on them? And why are they still being denied access to those files, even during this inquiry into undercover policing? Turning next, sir, to a discrete and important chapter, namely 1979 and Southall. The policing
Sir, Mr. Menon may just have temporarily frozen. What we'll do is we'll take 5 minutes and try and get him back on the call.
Very well.
So I believe Mr. Menon is back.
I can't see him.
Yes, here we go. I think we're there.
Mr. Menon, I think the shortcomings of technology were illustrated, but you are now restored and we can hear you. Mr. Menon, can you hear me?
So I think we better take maybe a longer break and see if Mr. Menon's internet.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, I can now hear you. I'm sorry, this shows the shortcomings of technology. Things go wrong every now and then, but I can now hear you and you can now hear me. So if you are able to proceed, would you please do so?
I will do so. I'm sorry. I think it was electricity fluctuation at my end.
These things happen, don't worry.
Thank you. I was just about to turn to 1979 in Southall. The policing of the counter-demonstration against the National Front election meeting at Southall Town Hall on the 23rd of April, 1979, during which Blair Peach, a socialist and anti-racist school teacher, was killed by a police officer from the infamous Special Patrol Group, is a stark microcosm of both violent political policing against the left and violent and racist political policing against a multiracial community with a substantial ethnic minority population. It is essential that the events in Southall are examined at length to understand how political policing at its worst works in practice. In his witness statement, Tariq Ali described the police killing of Blair Peach and the subsequent institutional cover-up as one of the most despicable events in the history of the Metropolitan Police. He was right. Moreover, the recent disclosure provides yet more evidence of the depths to which the police and others were prepared to sink in seeking to deflect blame onto others for the violence and unrest that the police undoubtedly caused in Southall. Tariq Ali was there. He attended the counter-demonstration against the National Front and its Nazi sympathizers in Southall. At the time, he was the Socialist Unity parliamentary candidate for Southall. The general election took place on the 3rd of May, 10 days later. Special Branch provided briefings in the days prior to the National Front meeting and counter-demonstration. One stated that the young ones within the community of Southall will provide the policing problem of the future, aggravated by the color of the skin and the culture, and stimulated by outside influences of left-wing origin. Another instructed officers to act firmly and actively from the start. A debrief on the day itself stated that it is generally recognized that Asians can be extremely emotional, volatile, and violent on occasions, and noted there was an insignificant number of white supporters, probably less than 100. Tensions were high in Southall on the day. Shops were closed. The Anti-Nazi League had called for a picket of the town hall. Thousands of local people and anti-fascists from across London attended, including veterans from the Battle of Cable Street in 1936 against Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists. After speaking at the rally, Tariq Ali and others were taken by the organizers to to the People's Unite Center on Parkview Road, as the organizers were worried that the police were getting out of control. The police later attacked this safe house, where those injured by the police were being brought for medical treatment, smashed up the premises, dragged out the occupants, beat them with truncheons, and arrested them. Tariq Ali was bleeding from the head and knocked unconscious by a police officer. Clarence Baker, a member of the Misty and Roots reggae band, was so badly injured by a police officer that he went into a coma and spent 3 weeks in hospital. Jack Droming, at the time a senior official of the Transport and General Workers Union, and later a Labour Member of Parliament from 2010 to 2022, told an inquiry by the National Council of Civil Liberties that he had never seen such unrestrained violence against demonstrators. The Special Patrol Group were just running wild. Tariq Ali was not even present on the streets when, according to eyewitnesses, unrest predictably broke out after the police went berserk, drove vans straight into the crowd, deployed mounted officers, and indiscriminately attacked those who were demonstrating against the National Front. Nevertheless, in a report recently disclosed, dated the 24th of April, 1979, entitled Demonstration with Disorder and Death, Southall, Monday, the 23rd of April, 1979, Detective Assistant Commissioner Helm accused Tariq Ali of being one of the prime movers of the disorder and civil disobedience. This was a brazen lie. Furthermore, Detective Assistant Commissioner Helm painted an entirely false picture of what happened in Southall, exonerating the police and the National Front and placing the blame for the unrest squarely on Asian youth, anti-fascists, and bizarrely on some Rastafarian squatters in Southall. He even blamed Asian youth for seriously injuring a man who was believed to be a National Front sympathizer. Although he mentioned in passing Blair Peach, suffering from a head injury from which he subsequently died, he disingenuously added that the circumstances of this death are not fully known. Detective Assistant Commissioner Helm knew perfectly well, even the day after, that Blair Peach had been killed by one of his officers. The blame game had begun. Although Sir Charles Pollard, a chief inspector in A8 in 1979, acknowledged that the Special Patrol Group occasionally went over the top, it seems clear that the order of the day was to crack down with brutality on the local ethnic minority community and their left-wing supporters and inflict as much pain, physical and psychological, as possible. The political and cultural alignment of the police and the National Front could not have been starker. There is now plenty of credible evidence in the public domain about what really happened at Southall, despite repeated attempts over the years to suppress the truth by, amongst others, the Metropolitan Police and the coroner, Dr. John Burton, who conducted the inquest into the death of Blair Peach. David Renton's article, The Killing of Blair Peach, is an excellent expose in the London Review of Books and highlights the salient facts. 1. On the 23rd of April, 1979, 2,875 officers, including 94 on horseback, were deployed to Southall to protect the rights of assembly of less than 100 National Front supporters, some of whom gave Nazi salutes as they entered and exited the town hall. 2, 14 eyewitnesses saw Blair Peach struck on the head with a truncheon by a police officer, 10 of whom gave evidence at the inquest. Blair Peach was admitted to intensive care with a fractured skull. He died in hospital. 3, some 700 protesters against the National Front were arrested, and some 342 were charged. Most of them were young Asians from Southall. Not a single National Front supporter was arrested or charged. 4, Commander John Cass, chief of the Metropolitan Police's Complaints Investigation Bureau, conducted an internal inquiry into the killing of Blair Peach. In June 1979, Commander Cass concluded in his first report that Blair Peach was killed by one of 6 Special Patrol Group officers. However, he anonymized their names. In September, 3 months later, Commander Cass set out further evidence in a second report implicating the 6 officers. 5, the Director of Public Prosecutions, Sir Thomas Hetherington, decided that no police officer would be prosecuted either for the murder of Blair Peach or for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. 6, although the coroner, Dr. Burton, had a copy of the first CAS report, he refused to disclose it to the family or their lawyers during the inquest. This was, we submit, an outrageous breach of due process, not to mention blatant judicial bias. 7, in June 1979, the lockers of the Special Patrol Group officers who were in Southall on the day were raided. Numerous offensive weapons were found, including a leather-covered stick, 2 knives, a very large truncheon, a metal cosh, a crowbar, and a whip. 8, the CAS reports were only published in April 2010, 31 years after Blair Peach was killed. The extraordinary delay in making these reports available to the public was indefensible and amounted, we submit, to a concerted cover-up by the state. 9, David Renton names the 6 Special Patrol Group officers in his article, one of whom killed Blair Peach, as Inspector Alan Murray, Police Constable Greville Bint, Police Constable James Scottow, Police Constable Anthony Richardson, Police Constable Michael Freestone, and Police Constable Raymond White. Inspector Murray was Commander Cass's prime suspect. 10, in June 1980, Dr. Burton sent the Home Office a draft of a controversial paper that he had written entitled The Blair Peach Inquest, the Unpublished Story. This has subsequently come into the public domain. In that paper, he blamed the protesters against the National Front for the killing of Blair Peach. He was at pains to stress that the National Front acted peacefully and that one of their number had been seriously injured on his way home. He accused the civilian witnesses at the inquest of fabrication, claiming that they told palpable lies and did not have experience of the English system sufficient to give credible evidence. He went even further and accused protesters of bombarding the police with bricks. Despite the racism and lunacy of this paper, Dr. Burton was rewarded by the state and later became coroner of the Queen's household from 1987 to 2002. Further support for the contention that the violence and public disorder at Southall was instigated and pre-planned by the police can be found in the material disclosed by the inquiry. When he gave evidence during Tranche 1, Phase 4, the closed session, HN 41, an SDS officer in 1979, says that he was warned by senior special branch officers not to go to Southall with his target group because the uniformed police were going to clamp down on the demonstrations and management considered the dangers were more than normal. In short and in summary, the police acted with impunity in Southall on the 23rd of April, 1979. This was a full-scale police-instigated riot against the local Asian community and the left. Blair Peach was killed, at least 3 anti-fascists suffered fractured skulls, and yet no police officer has ever been prosecuted for the killing of Blair Peach or the serious assaults on Clarence Baker, Tariq Ali, and dozens of others who were beaten severely on the day, or for any other offense for that matter. This itself speaks volumes about the reality of political policing and the role of the prosecuting authorities during this particular period. Turning briefly to the relevant legal framework, we are conscious that others are dealing with this in far greater length. It should be remembered that the United Kingdom government had signed the European Convention on Human Rights in 1951 and was one of the prime movers in this significant attempt to uphold fundamental human rights following the defeat of fascism in the Second World War. Aside from this, what protections did individual citizens of the UK have in the 1960s and 70s? There was, of course, the Bill of Rights, 1689, a core document of our uncodified constitution, but a partial document at best that was principally drawn up to protect the interests of the Protestant aristocracy in the City of London, as represented at the time through Parliament and the Crown. And there was common law, a body of unwritten laws based on judicial precedents arising from the appellate decisions of the Court of Appeal and the House of Lords over the past 300 years. The inquiry will, of course, be carefully considering the relevant legal framework, the roles played by the highest echelons of the constabulary and by senior civil servants and politicians will be of particular interest to you, sir. Other non-state core participants are making detailed submissions on these matters. Whilst we welcome any findings or recommendations by the inquiry that would allow the illegality of undercover policing to be inferred, we want to concentrate on the reasons why those in command of the institutions of the British state in 1968 were more than happy to countenance intrusive espionage on an industrial scale, and why they were obsessed with secrecy, not just from the public, but from Parliament too, lest they be found out. The reason is simple. It's political, of course. All the institutions of the British state had a natural right-wing bias. Their professed liberalism was only skin deep. Importantly, the leadership of both the Labour Party and the trade unions at the time were no exception to this innate conservatism. They too were more than happy to collude with the police, MI5, and other state institutions in opposing any threat to their control from the left. One cannot ignore the fact that the Special Demonstrations Squad was formed in 1968 under the Labour government of Harold Wilson and under the direct authority of James Callaghan, the then Labour Home Secretary, who later became Prime Minister in 1976. The initial justification in 1968 for setting up the SDS was, of course, the supposed public order threat from the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign demonstration in London against the Vietnam War that was planned for the 27th of October. In fact, MI5 had identified a change in political temperature and mood the previous year with the occupation of the Greek embassy on the 28th of April, 1967, which in turn was a response to the fascist coup by the Greek military just a week earlier. The Greek dictatorship proceeded to torture and murder workers and students until it was finally overthrown in 1974. Now, the importance of the Greek embassy occupation has not come to the fore in this inquiry. However, it was clearly of importance to the police and MI5. The Royal Hellenic Embassy, as it was officially called, was situated on Upper Brook Street, only 30 yards away from the United States Embassy in Grosvenor Square. This occupation, of course, had nothing to do with the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. It was largely organized by anarchists and members of the Committee of 100, a British anti-war group. Nevertheless, the occupation of an embassy in the heart of London and the prospect of the same happening to the US Embassy triggered a certain amount of panic in the highest circles of the British establishment. It is also important to remember the background to events in 1968 when the SDS was formed. The sympathies of the British state at the time were not just with the democracies of Western Europe and the United States. The United Kingdom was also in alliance with fascist Portugal and fascist Greece, both NATO members at the time. And although Franco's Spain, another fascist country in Europe, did not join NATO until 1982, it still enjoyed friendly ties at the time with the US and the UK. And of course, between 500,000 and 1.5 million people were killed during the Vietnam War after the United States invaded Vietnam in 1965. It was a combination of these close alliances, relationship, and world events, and many others. This is a short list of what was going on at the time that influenced the outlook of those in power at the heart of the British state, be they police officers, civil servants, soldiers, spies, or politicians. Now, there's one matter in relation to this not touched on anywhere, not least because we accept it as beyond the remit of this inquiry, namely the involvement of the US in spying on the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, particularly their central intelligence agency, the CIA, both through links with their counterparts in MI5 and through diplomatic channels. In 1967, the CIA had set up the Chaos Program to counter anti-war groups in the US. This entailed investigations into some 7,000 anti-war protesters there. This program was later characterized as a massive illegal domestic intelligence operation against the anti-war movement and other dissident groups. It is interesting that the first major target for the novel spying operation launched in London in 1968 was also an anti-war group, namely the VSC. There is little doubt that the CIA spied on American activists in London who were active in the VSC, and we can fairly assume, we submit, that they were given SDS product via MI5. It has always been our contention that the public order justification for setting up the SDS was a smokescreen for a simple public order failure by the police. And we repeat that again. We invited the inquiry to obtain evidence from the National Council for Civil Liberties archives, which are held at the University of Hull. That was declined, but we have had various news clippings from the press and some TV reports uploaded onto the system, contemporaneous from the time. These mainstream media reports were necessarily partial and subject to the prejudices of the day. In the recent disclosure, the inquiry released several documents concerning the role of civil servants in the Home Office, together with MI5 and others, in setting up committees on subversion in public life. Some of these documents allude to the role of the Information Research Department, the IRD, a shadowy unit within the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, specifically tasked to plant stories in the media about political opposition from the left. Certain newspapers, and of course the BBC, who had a dedicated MI5 agent working within their premises to monitor material pre-broadcast, were happy to act as conduits for IRD misinformation. We know that various media heads met directly with the Home Secretary, James Callaghan, for the purposes of being on side with the government's plan for the VSC demonstration in October 1968. They were directly briefed. However, we do not know what stories were planted in the media by the IRD or even by the Metropolitan Police themselves. We posit that the hype and hysteria about the demonstration in October was a product of state agencies with a complicit media. It made good copy, and it provided for the establishment and continuation of the SDS. It was a virtuous circle for the police, as it provided the necessary justification for the new unit they were setting up. Another result of the unrest at Grosvenor Square in March 1968 was the setting up of a small unit of 12 officers in New Scotland Yard called A8, under Superintendent Kenneth Newman initially, reporting to the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Operations and dedicated to public order planning. The uniformed branch of the Metropolitan Police was unhappy, understandably, about what had happened in Grosvenor Square and did not wish to rely simply on better intelligence. Their complaints to the Commander of Special Branch, Vic Gilbert, that they did not get top-class intelligence about the VSC in advance of the March 1968 demonstration was a blame game to cover up their own public order failures in Grosvenor Square. A8 was the response of the uniformed branch, and it was clearly effective on its own terms, regardless of any top-class intelligence or any other intelligence for that matter. John Cracknell, a former senior officer in A8, states that their own intelligence was based on reading the Morning Star and simply meeting with protest organizers, which he calls a very good mechanism for gathering information. Tony Speed, while stating for the record that A8 heavily relied on special branch threat assessments for operational planning, in fact, puts little real value on those very same threat assessments. Indeed, he says that special branch would occasionally overstate matters, and they were not always right. Many years later, in 1997, the Association of Chief Police Officers recommended that all public order intelligence be taken over by the uniformed branch, such little value that they place on special branch intelligence. Sir Giles Pollard, mentioned previously, involved at the heart of A8 planning, was also dismissive of the intelligence provided by special branch. This is what he says: "It was irrelevant to me to know about planned violence, as I had to prepare for the worst case scenario in any event. It was about covering our backs." In evidential terms, it's a shame that the entire A8 archive seems to have been lost or destroyed. This would have shown that special branch input was only a minor part of A8's public order planning, and did not provide any justification for SDS activity. And so we reiterate again, there was no need for the SDS to be formed, even after the events at Grosvenor Square in March 68. In Tranche 1, Phase 3, we were fortunate to hear live evidence from Roy Creamer, a former SDS officer, an officer who the inquiry had initially decided not to call, but after several of the non-state core participant teams recognizing his importance, asked for reconsideration of that decision. We are pleased that the decision was reversed and Roy Creamer was able to give evidence. And it's fair to say, sir, that he has been one of the few special branch voices from whom the inquiry's heard, who has given some credible evidence about the events between 1968 and 1982. Roy Creamer was of the view that the SDS will be wound up after the largely peaceful conclusion to the October 68 march. He was of the view that the SDS could not pick up any valuable public order intelligence by undercover methods. The old school methods, as far as he was concerned, were perfectly sufficient. He found the idea that A8 would benefit from special branch threat assessments laughable. And he was right. There was never any genuine public order justification for the setting up of this secret unit. It is of note that a later special branch report from 1977, reflecting on the successful policing of the VSC demonstration in October 1968, stated that mutual aid from other police forces, ensuring that the police were always present in massive numbers, was the key to success that finally ended the very violent demos in Grosvenor Square. In other words, it was just sensible public order policing based on obvious tactical considerations that stopped public disorder. It had nothing to do with intelligence obtained by undercover officers. Counsel to the inquiry, in his closing statement, accepts that it is difficult to assess the actual contribution of undercover policing to the outcome of the VSC demonstration in October 1968. But he adds, we say too generously that it might be said that the SDS reports on the VSC were timely and authoritative and consequently provided assurance to those planning the police response, thereby helping to avoid an overreaction. Unsurprisingly, counsel for the Metropolitan Police Service and the designated lawyer officer group go considerably further and maintain in their closing statements that the contribution of SDS intelligence to the outcome of the October 1968 demonstration was significant. And yet, no specific pieces of intelligence obtained by the SDS prior to the October 1968 demonstration have been identified by anybody that contributed to there having been only limited public disorder in October, by contrast with March. And that's a significant point, we submit. The idea that the SDS were gathering intelligence to prevent public disorder was a convenient fiction, a joke played on their own officers. HN 41, just one example, was one of many officers who simply did not understand that the SDS officers on the ground were being manipulated by forces way above their pay grade. Turning next, sir, to an important discrete topic, which others have touched upon already as well, namely the policing of the far right. Why is it that throughout the period from 1968 to 1982, the SDS did not deploy a single undercover officer into any far-right organizations other than the accidental deployment of an officer who had infiltrated the Workers' Revolutionary Party and was deployed by them to infiltrate the National Front? Why? Despite the growth, of the far right, despite their increasing extremism during the 1970s, and despite the concomitant rise in racist violence nationally, where was the supposed regard of the SDS for public order when it came to fascists and Nazi supporters? Now, the answer, I'm afraid, is to be found in the very nature of institutions like the police, special branch, MI5, the armed forces, and the civil service. The inconvenient truth is that there was a natural crossover between far-right organizations like the National Front and the British movement and key institutions of the British state. It's true, we accept that Special Branch had E-Squad, a squad that was partially dedicated to maintaining a watch on the far right. But throughout this period, in any event, senior officers, we would say incredibly, viewed the National Front as a legitimate political organization that was neither a threat to public order nor subversive, despite the fact that the National Front, from its very inception in 1967, was a party of self-avowed fascists and white supremacists committed to the expulsion of all non-white immigrants from the United Kingdom. And former SDS officer Angus McIntosh said that the SDS was standing ready to infiltrate the far right if necessary, but this was never approved or ordered in his time. He believed that this was a high-level policy decision. As an example, and it's but one, of the respectful relationship between the police and the far right, there is an illuminating Special Branch report from September 1968, when an SDS officer, HN 332, and a detective inspector, on the direction of a chief superintendent, visited Lady Jane Birdwood, a notorious fascist and anti-Semite, and had a chat with her in her garden while she railed against the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. It was all politeness and deference, with the officers even thanking her for her interest. What a far cry from how the police treat, to this day, ordinary left-wing activists. Later, in July 1977, a Special Branch detective inspector visited Martin Webster, a National Front leader, at their Teddington headquarters to inquire about their plans for their forthcoming Lewisham demonstration, only to find Mr. Webster's attitude uncooperative. This did not, however, provoke Special Branch to infiltrate the National Front. The inquiry must ask itself, we submit, why the SDS was so uninterested in the far right between 1968 and 1982, given the far right's neo-Nazi politics and their undoubted role in fueling the sharp rise of racist attacks against ethnic minorities nationally. An obvious answer is that the police were themselves institutionally racist and right-wing. One might even go further and say that the police were a natural recruiting ground for far-right organizations. One of the inevitable and tragic consequences of the failure of the police to tackle the far right was that the number of racist attacks against ethnic minorities in this country continued to increase dramatically during the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, as we shall see in tranches 2 and 3. Had the police taken steps to crack down on the far right during the 1970s and the perpetrators of racist violence generally, lives that were subsequently lost over the years could potentially have been saved. The other side of the coin is, of course, racist policing, a serious problem that has plagued relations between the police and ethnic minority communities for decades. This again will come more to light in future tranches, and we submit continues to be a largely unresolved problem to this day. There was also far-right terror against the left, with the firebombing of left-wing premises and bookshops. In 1979, a member of the National Front, Alan Birdley, was charged with possession of explosives linked to 24 such attacks. Targets included the anarchist bookshop Freedom, Houseman Bookshop, News from Nowhere Bookshop, Brighton Resource Centre, and the home of Peter Hay. The full story of far-right terror in the UK has not been told because its organized nature was largely ignored by the police and the prosecuting authorities during this period. Almost all of those arrested and prosecuted of a far-right persuasion were conveniently mischaracterized as lone wolves. No wonder the police were viewed by the left as sympathetic to the far right. They were. There is no question, standing back and looking at this period now, many years later, that the failure of the police to crack down on the far right led directly to violence on the streets. As the violence flared, the police inevitably called for greater funding and more weaponry. By 1982, following uprisings in many cities in the UK, the police were openly calling for armored vehicles, rubber bullets, CS gas, and water cannons. And indeed, Chief Constable James Anderton of the Greater Manchester Police ordered submachine guns for his officers in 1981, acting, he said, under the royal prerogative, but without any authorization from his own police authority. In the circumstances, it's difficult not to postulate whether the apparent blindness of the police to increasing far-right violence and criminality during the 1970s was not, in fact, a deliberate tactic, a strategy of tension, if you will, to enhance the role and power of the police while simultaneously blaming unrest and public disorder on the left. Finally, on this topic, we note what counsel to the inquiry and counsel for the designated lawyer officer group said in their closing statements about why the SDS did not target the far right between 1968 and 1982. Counsel to the inquiry said that the most likely reason was that there were alternative sources of intelligence available on the far right. Counsel for the designated lawyer officer group said that the reason that the SDS did not target the far right was not because of political bias. It was because there was no need to do so. There were other secret and reliable sources of intelligence on the far right. Now, all of this is rather cryptic. What other sources of intelligence? Are we talking about special branch intelligence? Are we talking about other Metropolitan Police intelligence? Are we talking about MI5 intelligence? Why not, given this is a public inquiry into undercover policing, spell it out openly and transparently so that the inquiry can properly evaluate whether political bias was at play, as we submitted was, and if so, to what extent? There is, I'm afraid, something more sinister at play here. We raise it, whether the inquiry is prepared to countenance it or not, because we believe it is important. We submit that far from being concerned about violence on the streets, many in the Metropolitan Police, both senior and junior officers, positively relished it. It would be extraordinarily naive to believe, as counsel for the designated lawyer officer group posited on Monday in his closing statement, that the police were politically neutral and caught in the middle between the left and the right. The history of the British police being used in a political context has always been to attack the working class and the left, be it Bloody Sunday in Trafalgar Square in 1887, the Tony Pandy riots in 1910 and 1911, the general strike of 1926, the National Hunger March in 1932, the Battle of Cable Street in 1936, the attacks on CND and other left protesters in the 1960s, or endless other examples that we could have provided. The SDS annual reports in the 1970s contend that the more militant protests of the 1960s had in fact died away by the 1970s. And as such, the supposed public order threat from the left had receded. Counsel to the inquiry's conclusion that there was a strong case that SDS should have been disbanded in 1976 is clearly consistent with that evidence. We now have further disclosure from A8 officers and their assessment of the relevance of special branch threat assessments. The prospect of violence during a protest was almost entirely dependent on the attitude of the police. The pickets and protests that turned violence sometimes began with pushing and shoving. This was fairly routine on pickets and protests, and something uniformed police could normally handle without resort to truncheons. But time and time again, senior police officers were happy to create the conditions for violence by ordering weapons to be drawn and ordering charges on unarmed protesters. The C Squad intelligence sent to A8 acted on the minds of senior officers and produced, we say, a mindset that the only people on protests were a marginalized bunch of long-haired students and Trotskyists who the police loathed. The senior officers at A8 made their plans for Red Lion Square in 1974, the Brunswick dispute from 1976 to 1978, Lewisham in 1977, Southall in 1979, and many other demonstrations and protests without taking the slightest notice of any C Squad threat assessments. In fact, the opposite was the case. The C Squad threat assessments acted as a justification for the police attacking with impunity those who they perceived as their political opponents. The police would protect National Front marches, but fight with anti-fascist counter-protesters. Having effective control over the narrative through a compliant media ensured that the police could subsequently justify their actions. The relationship between Special Branch, specifically C Squad, and A8 is worth further scrutiny. Roy Creamer, again, has provided 3 witness statements to the inquiry as well as giving live evidence. He recalled that the threat assessments provided by C Squad to A8 were telling them what they knew. It was not necessary, in his opinion, to provide intelligence to A8, as they already had it from local divisions and, more significantly, from the organizers of the protest themselves. He did not ever recall getting feedback from A8 on the intelligence provided by C Squad. Sir Charles Pollard, formerly in A8 and later a detective assistant commissioner, supports what Roy Creamer has to say. To quote him, "If we found out about an upcoming demo from the organizers, we would inform Special Branch and tell them what was going to happen. Rather amusingly, on a Thursday, we would then get a file marked secret with exactly the same information we had given them." The result of all of this was extraordinary levels of police violence. At Red Lion Square in 1974, we say a mounted police officer was almost certainly responsible for the death of Kevin Gately, regardless of what Lord Scarman's report may say about the matter. Before the Battle of Lewisham in 1977, looking at that briefly, the local MP and the Bishop of Southwark, amongst others, urged the new Metropolitan Police Commissioner, David McNee, to ban the upcoming National Front march through Lewisham. It was clearly provocative and would inevitably meet with resistance from the local community. Special Branch intelligence was quite clear. Quote, "The scene is set for a violent afternoon." Quote, "A potentially ugly and violent confrontation must be anticipated." But even without this intelligence, it was blindingly obvious that the National Front marching through a multiracial community with a high ethnic minority population in 1977 was bound to lead to trouble. And this was hardly rocket science. Roy Creamer was surprised, as he thought it was clear that the National Front march should be banned. But Commissioner McNee and Assistant Commissioner Gibson opposed the ban. According to Assistant Commissioner Gibson, there was a good case for resisting any call for a ban on the National Front march, as if the march was banned, a precedent would be set and the National Front would be unable to hold any marches in London. A ban would be welcomed by the left and resented by the right. Those quotes by Assistant Commissioner Gibson tell you, sir, all you need to know about the ideology of the police in the 1970s and their policing priorities. As Commissioner McNee refused to exercise his powers under the Public Order Act 1936, a case was taken to the High Court by the local MP and others. In response, Commissioner McNee submitted an affidavit. Remarkably and mendaciously, he stated that no serious public disorder would ensue and no information was available as to the counter-protest. Consequently, the High Court refused to order a ban. A political decision had been deliberately engineered by the police at the highest level. The National Front March would be looked after by the Metropolitan Police, and police serials equipped with riot shields for the very first time in England would be responsible for containment of the counter-protesters. Is it any surprise that the events of the day are recorded by history as the Battle of Lewisham? As any fair-minded and objective observer could grimly have predicted would happen, mass disorder broke out on the streets of Lewisham. The Metropolitan Police took the opportunity to test their new public order tactics, and the Labour government failed to intervene. The subsequent killing of Blair Peach by the police in Southall 2 years later was the apogee of this period of police brutality against the left. Ultimately, both protest and public disorder arise from objective conditions. They cannot be willed into existence. Occasionally, this has been recognized by the police. Only occasionally, but at least occasionally. A special branch report into the Brixton riots of 1981, for example, an event that bookends Tranche 1 of the inquiry, concluded that there was almost no involvement by the left in these events. In fact, they had almost no presence in the local community. It was a purely spontaneous uprising by local people, triggered by racist targeting by the Metropolitan Police, against a background of years and years of racist policing and deprivation. Once again, the involvement of the Special Patrol Group, here as part of Operation Swamp, as the trigger for serious violence in Brixton, simply underlines the brutal nature of British political policing during this period. Turning next to the relationship between the SDS and MI5. The true role of the SDS, we say, was spying on behalf of MI5. MI5 had seen the value of this new unit from the outset, and no doubt could not believe their luck. In 1968, MI5's domestic counter-subversion effort was primarily concentrated on the Communist Party of Great Britain. They had little coverage of other groups on the left or anarchist groups, mainly because such groups represented no serious threat. In a 1967 report on subversion, MI5 assessed Trotskyism in the UK as presenting only a limited threat. But once MI5 saw how the SDS worked in operation, with their collateral approach of sweeping wide, they realized that they could hoover up, via the SDS, large amounts of intelligence on a range of groups, regardless of their political importance. 5 years previously, in 1963, whilst investigating the Profumo affair, Lord Denning had pronounced it a cardinal principle that MI5 operations, and I quote, are to be used for one purpose and one purpose only, the defense of the realm. They are not to be used so as to pry into any man's private conduct or business affairs, or even into his political opinions, except insofar as they are subversive, that is, they would contemplate the overthrow of the government by unlawful means. Most people in this country would, I am sure, wholeheartedly support this principle, for it would be intolerable to us to have anything in the nature of a Gestapo or secret police to snoop into all that we do, let alone into our morals, end quote. Now, whether Lord Denning was being disingenuous or whether he was simply ignorant of the role of MI5, we do not know. But he was plainly wrong. Industrial scale snooping did not begin with the SDS. By 1968, the MI5 registry already had a card index system of files that kept information on between 600,000 and 1 million people in the UK. It is reported in the recent disclosure that the police hardly ever refused a request from MI5. Numerous reports show how MI5 wined and dined special branch officers in the local pubs of Mayfair, and the special branch officers lapped it up. Of course, for MI5, the SDS had discovered offered plausible deniability. It was purely a police operation, and the Metropolitan Police could harp on about public order as their justification. It was a perfect MI5 operation. The product of almost every single SDS report went to MI5. Thousands of files were opened. Of course, MI5 did not believe everything they were told. They had their own agents and could cross-check information and produce a more reasoned analysis. They were probably cognizant of the fact that undercover police officers needed on occasion to over-elaborate to justify their continued existence. However, the significance of this vast intelligence operation was that thousands of ordinary citizens who had done nothing more than go to a meeting or a demonstration or join a lawful left-wing organization were reported and on occasion denied employment and even a career. Lives were damaged, even destroyed. Let's make no bones about it. And the police and MI5 simply didn't care because their targets were, as Margaret Thatcher, when Prime Minister, later declared, the enemy within. It's for this reason that Tariq Ali was shocked when he appeared on the BBC Troop Spies documentary in 2002 to learn that the VSC and the International Marxist Group had been infiltrated by undercover police officers. He fully expected the routine surveillance, as described by Roy Creamer, the simple monitoring of meetings and literature, telephone tapping, even informers. But to infiltrate themselves into people's lives and homes, even their beds, as long-term agents was not something even the Metropolitan Police had ever done before. This relationship between the SDS and MI5 was described by Roy Creamer as a master-servant one, and we submit this was entirely correct. Roy Creamer felt that C Squad were very much treated as messenger boys by MI5. He recalled that 80% of the bread and butter work of most C Squad officers was fulfilling MI5 requests. As he put it, we would not take the initiative on political extremists. We were guided entirely by what MI5 felt to be subversive. In 1984, Sir Brian Cubbon, permanent Undersecretary of State at the Home Office, queried whether a chief constable could in fact, as opposed to in theory, decline to accept a task which MI5 wished Special Branch to carry out. Special Branch SDS reporting on activists gave MI5 a huge base of information for their vetting activity. A major concern of the state has always been to keep left-wingers or those deemed subversive out of the civil service, the media, and industry. Of course, we do not know what other use was made of the information gathered, but we know the information included the slightest details about people's private lives, their partners, their sexual orientation, the sort of tittle-tattle that could easily be used to unsettle or even blackmail. Black ops is a normal part of intelligence work. Notwithstanding that subservient relationship, the Met and Special Branch were occasionally uneasy about MI5 and sought to protect their undercover officers. They didn't fully trust MI5 all the time and hence did not share information about the identity of their undercover officers in the field. And this is the reason why the reports list undercover officers as attendees frequently to hide their identity. The worry was that as MI5 relied on both informers and long-term agents, the officers might be compromised, perhaps even to build up an MI5 agent's cover. The murky world of spying was a dirty business indeed. During the 1970s, some Labour MPs and councillors up and down the front country finally began raising questions about the conduct of the police, including Special Branch. Outside London, the counties had police authorities, and police annual reports were meant to go to them. But these reports were largely silent about Special Branch activity. MPs and councillors wanted democratic accountability of the police, including Special Branch. In London, of course, the situation was different. The Home Secretary was the police authority for the metropolis, and hence the Metropolitan Police was accountable to an elected politician. In 1981, Ken Livingstone was elected leader of the Greater London Council, the GLC. A campaign later began to make the GLC the police authority for the metropolis, in line with other police forces around the country. Concurrently, Parliament was persuaded to examine the activity of Special Branch and gave this work to the Home Affairs Select Committee. These two actions led to fury and terror within the heart of the British establishment. The Met, ACPO, MI5, and Home Office civil servants effectively colluded to mislead Parliament and cover up the existence of the SDS. They feared political embarrassment because they knew what they were doing was anti-democratic and wrong. Sir, I note the time. I think I'll just be about 2-3 minutes more. I hope that's okay.
Forgive me, I was on mute. Certainly it is.
Thank you. Special Branch and MI5 went into overdrive to spy on and report on the GLC and those engaged in police monitoring, horrified at the idea that the police could be democratically accountable at all, let alone to a left-leaning GLC. We'll undoubtedly hear more about this in Tranche 2. Our democratic elected politicians, sadly, were hoodwinked. They were assured by the blandishments of the executive, the civil servants, and the police that nothing was amiss. Had they, in fact, been allowed to pursue their mandate properly, and had they discovered the existence of the SDS and their spying operations, it is almost certain that the SDS would have been wound up and heads would have rolled. Notwithstanding the best efforts of the police and their allies in government, nothing could stop the sheer momentum of those campaigning for greater police accountability. And during tranches 2 and 3, we will undoubtedly discover the full extent of that spying on justice campaigns and others at the forefront of this important movement. In conclusion, sir, there was, we submit, something rotten at the heart of the British state between 1968 and 1982, as secret political policing became increasingly entrenched within the security apparatus of the state. The greatest lie in this inquiry is that SDS and MI5 operations were to prevent public disorder and protect parliamentary democracy. This was just a veneer. The police, MI5, and their allies in the civil service and government, above all, served their own interests. If there is something called the British establishment, it is this concurrence of political and ideological interests that are so profoundly anti-democratic in nature. If there was any threat to parliamentary democracy post-1968, it was never from the left. Sir, that completes our Tranche 1 closing statement on behalf of Tariq Ali, Ernie Tate, and Piers Corbyn.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm grateful to you for finishing nearly on time.
Thank you.
Mr. Scobie.
Thank you, sir. I appear with Piers Marquis of Doughty Street Chambers and Paul Heron of Public Interest Law Centre. And this is our closing submission for Tranche 1 of the undercover policing inquiry on behalf of our three core participants, Richard Chesham, Mary, and Lindsay German. An issue has been raised in respect of our submissions, potentially breaching parliamentary privilege. Accordingly, perhaps cautiously, we have, for the time being, made redactions to our submissions. We will consider the law on the issue and return to these areas at the beginning of the Tranche 2 period. We address the key issues on behalf of Richard Chesham and Mary in our Phase 2 opening statement. In our Phase 3 opening statement, we focused on Lindsay German, who was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party from 1972, with roles on the Central Committee of that party for more than 30 years. We ask that this closing statement is read alongside those documents. We are grateful to the inquiry for allowing us additional time to present our closing submission. However, we ask those who are listening to consider this statement alongside the published written version, which is detailed, fully referenced, and available on the Public Interest Law Centre website. In this closing statement, we'll demonstrate 6 principal points. Number 1, the Rick Clark deployment was not simply an intelligence gathering exercise. It was designed with the knowledge and approval of special branch managers and MI5 to undermine a democratic organization. Point number 2, this undermining of a democratic organization was one of a range of countermeasures endorsed by government. Point number 3, post-1972, the principal purpose of the SDS was not to assist with maintaining public order. Its task, in conjunction with MI5, was to spy on citizens who were politically active, particularly in the trade union movement. Point number 4, government knew and approved, encouraged and enabled the continuation of the SDS. Point 5, from as early as 1975, the SDS management knew of undercover officer sexual relationships with their targets. And 6, point number 6, the public were continually deceived by government as to the function and tasking of special branch. Part 1, the Rick Clark deployment. This inquiry started with a preconception that the deployment of HN 297, Richard Clark, Rick Gibson, was unremarkable. The evidence of Richard Chesham and Mary was critical in demonstrating that that preconception was misconceived, and that led to recognition from the inquiry that a mistake had been made in that prejudging of a deployment. That recognition was both welcome and encouraging. The known facts about Clark's deployment are as follows. He dishonestly appropriated the identity of a child who had died. He was deployed directly into a university with the Troops Out movement as his pre-deployment target. He established a branch of the Troops Out movement where one had not previously existed. He encouraged others to assist him in that endeavor. When they did so, he opened files on them and reported on them. In Richard Chesham's case, that led to his lifelong blacklisting. Clark spent time in the home addresses of these people, abusing their hospitality and embarking on sexual relationships with at least 2 of them. He rose incrementally to the top of the Troops Out movement, taking over higher positions of responsibility within the movement and undertaking executive actions that can only have destabilized it and were plainly likely to destabilize it. He then attempted to use that position to decapitate the whole movement, whilst ingratiating himself with Big Flame and embarking on at least 2 further sexual relationships. He only stopped because his activity was discovered. Big Flame activists confronted him with his birth and death certificates. The outing of Richard Clarke was so significant for the SDS that it went down in SDS folklore and was used as a cautionary tale for decades. All of that is now established, and because it is established, a more important set of issues arises. In respect of each one of Clarke's actions and his objectives, the question is, why? Ultimately, why was this officer put where he was to do what he did? Richard Chesham was able to come to educated conclusions about some of the reasons for what Clarke did, basing those conclusions on his first-hand experience of the man and the movement and on the documents that have been disclosed. Ultimately, Chesham could not give any definitive answer as to why, nor, of course, could Clarke himself. He died some years ago. Geoffrey Craft was the SDS inspector from early 1974 until some point in 1976, when he became the chief inspector, a role that he remained in until the autumn of 1977. He was therefore a managing officer of the SDS throughout Clarke's deployment, which lasted from December 1974 to September 1976. In addition, from 1981 to 1983, Craft was chief superintendent of Special Branch in charge of S Squad, with the SDS as his biggest responsibility. Craft was best placed to assist the inquiry in respect of Rick Clarke's remarkable deployment. Anything that is remarkable is likely to be memorable. We submitted over 70 pages of questions for counsel to the inquiry to ask Geoffrey Craft. Each question was supported by reference documentary evidence, setting a context, foundation, and rationale for asking it. We have published the full set of questions on the Public Interest Law Centre website. Those questions were key to understanding both the Rick Clarke deployment and, because it was so significant, all of the deployments that followed. Because of that significance, we submitted those questions to the inquiry far in advance of the deadline for doing so, to ensure that they could be properly considered and included in counsel to the inquiry's questions. Many of the key questions were not asked. We don't know why. It may be that the inquiry already has in mind the documentary evidence and the strong inferences that can be drawn from them. But if there have been preconceptions about Geoffrey Craft, based perhaps on his career trajectory or the subjective character references of some of the officers who served under him, we asked the inquiry to exercise great caution. The Rick Clarke deployment is very important to this inquiry. It has far-reaching implications in respect of the use to which the unit was put and the tactics that it used. It will be very fortunate and convenient for many of the state corps participants if the inquiry were to find that Clarke was a maverick officer who was acting on his own. On the evidence, that is not a realistic conclusion. It is not sustainable to conclude that Clarke did what he did off his own bat or was running wild. We are going to reference as much of that documentary evidence that we included in our questions as we can in the time available. Then we're going to invite you to draw conclusions from them that we suggest are inescapable. Positions of responsibility. The key aspect of Rick Clarke's deployment was that he set up a branch of the Troops Out movement and subsequently rose to the top of the movement nationally. Mr. Craft's position, as set out in his statement, was that he knew absolutely nothing about it. In his oral evidence to the inquiry, he conceded, as he had to, that if an officer were to take a position of high office in a political organization, that would risk influencing the freedom of expression and political action of the group. He was then asked the following question: Mr. Craft, if you had known that Richard Clarke had risen to high office in the Troops Out movement, including becoming the convener to the National Secretariat, would you have approved? Unsurprisingly, following such a leading question, he answered, no. That question is as interesting as the answer. It presupposes that Craft was telling the truth when he said that he knew nothing at all. It also presupposes that Rick Clarke did what he did without approval. These are dangerous preconceptions. They bury the truth. They set Rick Clarke up to take the fall for a deployment that did impact on the political action and freedom of expression of the Troops Out movement. They are as wrong as the preconception that his deployment was unremarkable. Chief Inspector Craft did know that Clarke had targeted the movement and set up the branch. He did know that Clarke had risen to the highest office in the movement, and he did prove it. He also did know that Clarke undertook a number of actions that inevitably impacted on the political action and freedom of expression of the movement. He approved that too. Of course, there's the obvious inconsistency between the account of a chief inspector maintaining that he employed the highest levels of monitoring and supervision, while simultaneously not noticing an officer's 21-month meteoric rise through the movement's hierarchy. To accept that would be stretching credulity. It's a breaking point. It's all the more incredible when one looks at Craft's account of how often he looked at the reports of his officers. He would only see reports if there was something particularly interesting in them, and would not sign them unless there was something specifically to sign. The fact is that the report from Clarke that dealt with his involvement in establishing the South East London branch of the Troops Out movement was so particularly interesting that Craft did indeed sign it off personally. There are 4 reports within a month of each other dealing with Clarke's elections as branch secretary, as a delegate to the London Coordinating Committee, the All London Meeting, and the National Coordinating Committee. All of those were interesting enough to have been signed off by Craft's superior, DCI Neil. The next month, Craft was signing off the reports that indicated Clarke had achieved those positions. Clarke then signed off the report dealing with Clarke's further election as delegate to London Coordinating Committee. Neil signed off a further election as delegate to National Coordinating Committee and Clarke's attendance at a private meeting with Jerry Lawless, the head of the movement. But Craft was back signing for the next delegate election 2 weeks later. Neil signed off the election to a national position on the organising committee for London, his election as London organiser, his nomination for a position on the National Secretariat, and his role as organiser of the national rally. But it was Craft who signed off his election for a role on the press committee, and most importantly, when Rick Clarke took Lawless's position as convener of the Secretariat and took charge of the whole movement, it's Craft's signature on the report. Neil signed off those reports in dealing with Clarke's early attempts to create division and dissent when he severely criticised another section of the movement and launched a scathing attack on some members. But once in place at the top, when he insisted on the removal of troop-site movement press officer from the Secretariat, when as convener, he delayed a long-planned trade union delegation to Ireland, severely criticised another member, and prepared documents for circulation to the press. Kraft signed off every report. When, as convener, Clark censured another very prominent member of the troop-site movement. Once again, it was Kraft who signed the report. And when it was reported that 4 months into Clark's leadership, at least one prominent organization withdrew its support for troop-site movement because the atmosphere was increasingly reformist, again, it was Kraft signing off. When serious dissent was noted with an international Marxist group over the postponement of the delegation to Northern Ireland, and that by the time Lawless returned, 2 members of the Secretariat had resigned, there at the bottom of the report is Kraft's signature. Rick Clark conspired with members of Big Flame to plot opposition and resistance to the leadership of the troop-site movement. He facilitated that even to the extent of risking the security of the SDS by holding the meeting at his police cover flat. That critical report was also signed off by Kraft. On the 2nd of September 1976, shortly before his identity was discovered, Clark held a meeting in which the major aim of the 9 attendees was the defeat of the present leadership of troop-site movement and the replacement of them by independent members. Clark was described as influential and was named as the second of 5 proposed new leaders. It was a coup, signed off by Geoffrey Kraft. In our first opening statement to the inquiry, we warned of the risk of individual officers being scapegoated and made to carry the can. This was precisely why we did so. None of those documents were put to Kraft, and none of those questions were asked, even though we spoon-fed the inquiry with them. Instead, Kraft was led by the hand to say that he neither knew nor approved. Kraft should not have had his hand held on any issue, but certainly not one as important as this. Kraft knew that Clark went to the top of the troop-site movement and conspired to destabilize it. His continued approval and authority for it is stamped on the bottom of every report. His superior officers knew as well. Their stamps of approval and authority are there too. The dispersal of the knowledge and approval can be followed up the Metropolitan Police hierarchy just by looking at the minute sheets. Critically, every single one of those reports was sent to MI5 at box 500. They saw them all. If they were asked, MI5 would not be able to pretend they did not know that an SDS officer had rapidly risen through the ranks of the troop-site movement, right to the very top. They could not pretend that they did not know that an SDS officer was plotting to destabilize a democratic movement. They could not say they were unaware of the source of the reports. Their knowledge that Rick Clark, as Rick Gibson, was an SDS agent is clearly stated in a security services minute sheet. They knew who he was, and they knew what he was doing. The likelihood is that the knowledge and approval went higher than that. We shall deal with that aspect more generally at a later stage in these submissions. Richard Walker, detective sergeant in the SDS back office throughout Clark's deployment, was conscious that the reporting was likely to go not just to the security services, but to the Home Office as well. This inquiry cannot be complicit in scapegoating Rick Clark, whether Kraft remembers it or not, the evidence overwhelmingly shows that Clarke was not acting alone. The Clarke deployment conclusively demonstrates that the Metropolitan Police and the security services were using a secret police unit to destabilize and decapitate a democratic movement. The SDS was authorized and encouraged to do exactly that. That is a fact. The inquiry cannot shy away from that. We do not expect it will do so. The fact that fact has far-reaching implications for every aspect of this inquiry. It raises questions about the true function of the SDS. It cannot be argued that it was simply an intelligence-gathering organization when it plainly was not. Additionally, it raises questions as to the true state and purpose of the SDS. It's impossible to argue that this activity had any role in preventing disorder or countering subversion, however one chooses to define that conveniently fluid concept. It casts a shadow over the credibility of any witness who protests that somehow the SDS was a protector of our right to free speech and our democratic right to organize. It is a stark reminder that dishonesty is the lifeblood of these people. They sought out a career that was founded on deceit, and their success or otherwise depended on how dishonest they could be. It puts a perspective on the tactics that were used by the SDS, be they the dishonest appropriation of dead children's identities, the cultivation of false friendships, or sexual exploitation of activists. A state that is prepared to undermine the very democracy that it loudly purports to be protecting is a state with very few qualms at all. The Troop Site Movement. The Troop Site Movement was established in 1973 as a campaign group whose aim was publicly stated and straightforward: self-determination for the Irish people and the withdrawal of British troops from Northern Ireland. Their methods were lobbying members of Parliament, drafting alternative legislation, and raising awareness, with the occasional low-key demonstration, talks, and film screenings. It had already been infiltrated by the SDS when Clarke was sent in. HN 298 Mike Scott was reporting on the movement in 1974 and was withdrawn after he broke his finger punching Jerry Lawless in the face. Very shortly after Scott stopped reporting on the Troop Site Movement, Rick Clarke was sent in. We know there were other SDS infiltrations after Clarke. Detective Inspector McIntosh, who served in the SDS between April 1976 and autumn 1979, noted the successful infiltration of the movement and implied infiltrations other than Clarke in the period up to 1979. The SDS was certainly supplying the security services with intelligence on the Troop Site Movement in the summer of 1980. The officer concerned was involved enough to have been in closed meetings. It's referred to in a liaison file, but no disclosure has been provided in respect to the officer who sourced the information or his role in the movement. Towards the end of 1980, HN 96 Michael James began reporting on the Troop Site Movement, having been encouraged to do so by the SDS management. He was elected to the National Steering Committee in November and December 1981, taking the position of National Membership Secretary, second only to the National Convener. He reported on the Troop Site Movement from that position well into 1983. Mike Scott concluded that the Troop Site Movement had no subversive objectives and did not employ or approve of the use of violence. There is nothing in any of Rick Clark's reporting to suggest subversion or any public order risk. The same is true of the reporting of Michael James. Generally, there has been no reporting suggesting public disorder at any troops out movement event. Interestingly, Geoffrey Craft was the SDS detective inspector and chief inspector for both the Scott and Clark deployments. He was the chief superintendent of S-Squad, with the SDS as his biggest responsibility in that role at the time of the James deployment. Craft himself agreed that the organization was not subversive and the public order risk was just in case, or trying, as he put it, to be ahead of the game, i.e., there was no public order risk, but it was conceivable that there might be one day. That argument might have a shred of credibility for a one-year deployment to assess a situation, but Craft had officers in there for at least 7 of the 10 years between 1974 and 1983. Clearly, there was no game to be ahead of. It's worth noting that under the just-in-case theory of public disorder prevention, Special Branch could try to retrospectively justify any infiltration of any protest or campaign group. There did not have to be a genuine risk of disorder or even a suggestion of one. Craft called this the ultimate defense line that would prevent any embarrassment if the SDS existence were ever to become public knowledge. Another way of phrasing ultimate defense line is ultimate excuse. And it is the excuse that we have heard repeated time and time again. Absent a subversion or a public order justification, the fallback justification for the repeated infiltrations of the troops out movement seems to be that it might have provided intelligence on Irish Republicans, particularly in the light of a policy decision not to infiltrate any actual Irish Republican movement. It was a soft option, along the lines of the policy decision not to infiltrate fascists because they were too dangerous and criminal for a police officer to infiltrate. An interest in possible Irish Republicans does not explain why it was that Richard Chesham, Mary, and countless others had Special Branch files created on them, and the detail of the minutiae of their lives passed on to the security services with life-changing consequences. It does not explain why authority and approval was given to undermine the troops out movement to the extent that it was undermined. If Big Flame had not discovered and outed Rick Clark when they did, there would have been a coup. It may or may not have been successful, but it would inevitably have had consequences for the movement. What is clear is that the troops out movement was riven to the extent that it was widely viewed as being too busy fighting amongst themselves to do any good work on the troops out issue. It had had undercover officers running the movement for at least 5 of its first 10 years. By the time they left, it was a shell of a movement. Its registered office was a council flat just south of King's Cross. Tragically, more than 3,500 people lost their lives in the Troubles before the troops eventually left. Mary. There are a number of inconsistencies at the heart of Craft's evidence about sexual relationships. On the one hand, Craft emphasizes careful recruitment of SDS officers based on the results of their vetting and their good reputation within a small special branch where everyone had a reputation very quickly. On the other hand, Craft claims not to have known about Richard Clarke's reputation within that same small special branch, as being a bit of a lad, a womanizer, and a carnivore, despite evidence of it being generally well known among the existing SDS officers. Craft emphasizes the very close officer supervision and close camaraderie of the SDS, yet claims to have had no knowledge of any sexual relationships at all, despite the proliferation of them under his command, and two officers being honest enough to say that managers knew, either with certainty or in all likelihood. Craft was asked about the particular risk of an undercover officer being put directly into a university situation where he would inevitably be involved with young, single women. He replied that he did not think of that at the time, but accepted that with hindsight, of course, he recognized the risk. That concession was inevitable. It's difficult to imagine how anyone could not recognize the risk. It's even more difficult to square his account that he, a 40-year-old detective chief inspector of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, was too naive to recognize it. But somehow, since then, he acquired the necessary life experience to see what is already plain to the rest of us. Craft put an undercover police officer into a university at a time when the sexual revolution was well underway and more permissive attitudes to sexual liberation, particularly in a university setting, were commonplace and common knowledge. He did so in the full knowledge that his success or failure as an undercover officer was dependent on him forming relationships with activists. Craft was also in the unique position of actually reading and signing off the reports that Rick Clarke was generating. Yet, somehow, he did not see the red flags. Clarke's first 6 reports included personal details of single female students and made it plain that he was spending time at home with them. You don't have to be a detective, let alone a detective chief inspector, to have an alarm bell ring when those reports arrive on your desk. Every one of those reports was signed off by Chief Inspector Craft at a time when he was closely monitoring his officers, particularly one who'd only just entered the field. Those reports, along with all the others, went up to another senior officer who also signed them off before being sent to the security service. It'll be interesting to hear every one of them plead naivety. The real insight into Craft's approach to sexual relationships came in the unguarded moments of his exculpatory, belittling assertions that sexual activity does not require an exchange of CVs and that these things happen. The truth about his recognition of risk came in his acknowledgement of what he actually saw as an inevitability. How does one prevent it? The line between an accepted inevitability and knowledge is very thin indeed, particularly for an organization that mastered in deceit. I had no qualms about using people generally. Graham Coates, HN 304, had no doubt that all of the SDS managers were aware of Rick Clarke, having had at least one sexual relationship. It was made quite plain with jokes and banter that they knew, we knew, and management knew what was going on. Craft used repeated denial as his own ultimate defense line, in the same way that he denied all knowledge of the anti-democratic activity that he repeatedly signed off. Big Flame and Rick Clarke's discovery. A conspicuous hole in Craft's evidence was in relation to the discovery of Rick Clarke's identity by members of Big Flame. Craft had a very close involvement in the creation of undercover officer identities and was personally involved in the creation of Rick Clarke's cover identity. He was very aware of the paramount importance placed on the secrecy of the SDS and the need to avoid the political embarrassment that would befall the Metropolitan Police and the Home Office should the operation become public. He cited his own recognition of the political sensitivity when personally assuring the Home Office that the officers were provided with the strongest possible cover backgrounds compatible with the modern computer age. Kraft was also very much involved in the exfiltration of SDS officers, discussing with them how they would come out of the field, what their story would be, and how it would be explained. He considered it to be a serious matter. The impact of Big Flame's discovery of Rick Clark's death certificate must have been ground-shaking for the Metropolitan Police. Their computer-age compliance security had been breached. The assurances they had given the Home Office in respect of it were worthless. The protracted police applications for anonymity in this inquiry suggested danger to these officers in their undercover roles. If that were true, every SDS officer in the field would have been at risk if, as Mr. Kraft suggests, Clark's deployment into the troops movement involved intelligence on Irish republicanism. The police would have been fraught with concern about repercussions. Most importantly, the compromise risked the public outing of the SDS and the inevitable political fallout. That political fallout would have been all the more terrifying because special branch activity was the subject of particular public scrutiny at the time. The impact would have been all the more significant in the context of a deployment into a broad-based single-issue movement that could not be justified on either subversion or public order grounds. It was also in the context of an officer who'd been engaged in blatantly anti-democratic activity within the knowledge of those who outed him and with a paper trail that confirmed the knowledge and approval of both the Metropolitan Police and the security services. There would have been heads rolling all the way up the hierarchy. How far up it went would have only depended on the extent to which it could be covered up. For Kraft, as the chief inspector in charge, it would have been career-ending. He would have been remembered as the officer who presided over the demise of the unit. A full decade later, in June 1986, Special Branch was so concerned about the details of Rick Clark's deployment being made public that the commander issued a memorandum directing the attention of all officers to Richard Chesham, warning them that he was speaking to a freelance investigative journalist about Clark and Big Flame. We did not know exactly when in 1986 Mr. Kraft retired, but if he was still working in the summer of that year, he himself would have received the alert. The incident was such a key moment in the SDS history that 20 years later, every single officer was familiar with the story of an SDS officer being confronted with his own death certificate. And yet the statements of the two officers in charge of the SDS at the time, Detective Chief Inspector Kraft and Detective Inspector McIntosh, are silent on the issue. Conspicuously silent. The only reference Kraft made to the compromise in his statement was a single sentence in the middle of a paragraph on officer welfare. He referred to an occasion Rick Clark thought he had been rumbled and was called to a meeting in a pub. In the section on the use of deceased children's identities, there is no reference to it at all. McIntosh started in the SDS in April 1976 and was well in place and working in September 1976. In his statement about exfiltration generally, he said, "I do not remember one exfiltration causing any trouble at all." In the section of his statement where he was asked specifically about Rick Clark, he makes no reference at all to the discovery of the death certificate or his exfiltration. These are striking omissions. Senior officers who are at best being deliberately unforthcoming. Coupled with that is the bizarre insistence from both officers that neither of them recalls ever having worked with the other. Despite there being an 18-month period when they were together in charge of the SDS, Kraft states he did not overlap with Mackintosh at all in the SDS. And Mackintosh states he does not remember ever working with Kraft. They clearly were working with each other, and they were definitely working together in September 1976, the very month of Clark's outing. There is documentary evidence to put that beyond question. Kraft maintained his memory block throughout his oral evidence and was unable to explain it, but conceded in the face of the documentary evidence that they must have been working together. Mackintosh began by maintaining his memory block. He put it down to being away for long training courses during his deployment when he would have overlapped with Kraft, particularly for major incidents. That account does not correlate with the actual periods of training that Mackintosh is recalled as having done, which only account for 4 months of the 18-month overlap, and which took place in the year after the outing of DC Clark. However, almost imperceptibly, Mr. Mackintosh slipped up in the middle of his evidence. Having maintained his zero recollection of working with Kraft, he was asked some questions about the management style of DCI Mike Ferguson. He was asked if he recalled Ferguson's rigorous testing of new officers on their identities. Was that something common? Did Mike Ferguson tend to do that with undercover officers when they first started? His reply, Jeff Kraft as well. In a split second, he let it be known that he remembered working with Jeff Kraft only too well. That slip was not followed up by counsel to the inquiry. That's unfortunate, because a contrived mutual memory loss is very convenient. It prevents questioning and inquiry on the way in which management discussed and decided to deal with events as significant as Rick Clark's outing, or very shortly afterwards, in November 1976, the antics of HN 300, Jim Pickford. Both Kraft and Mackintosh did expand on their recollections of the Clark outing in their oral evidence. Both recalled going to a pub because Clark had been uncovered. Kraft said he'd gone with Derek Neal, that Clark had given an excuse that Big Flame appeared to have accepted. All appeared to be well. He and Neal had debriefed Clark the following day and decided to withdraw him anyway. Essentially, Kraft downplayed the problem and put himself with a more senior officer who is now dead and therefore unable to assist. Mackintosh said he had gone with a surveillance team. He did not know any details of the potential compromise. He illogically prevaricated on Kraft's presence or otherwise, presumed that Jeff Kraft had dealt with it with another unnamed member of staff, which was why he said he did not remember working with Kraft before remembering it, at least to the best of his belief. He accepted that it was an event of great significance operationally, that without doubt the SDS would have been very concerned about it. He just said it had nothing to do with him. Both were reluctant to refer to the production of a death certificate. Kraft did so. Obliquely, when pressed, Mackintosh maintained that he was not aware of one being produced at the time. Neither account was credible, but both were framed to ensure that any questions on the internal inquiry into the reason for the compromise were not going to lead anywhere. Fortunately, there's an official confirmation of both production of the death certificate and how disturbing the compromise was for the Metropolitan Police senior officers. Mr. Craft's account that Clark came out of the pub giving no indication of any concern, so they waited until the next day for a debrief and then decided there was little point in leaving him out there, does not fit any of the surrounding circumstances. Richard Chesham's account, albeit secondhand, that Clark went white as a sheet and that his cover flat was stripped overnight is a response that's far more in keeping with the reality of the fear that must have gripped the SDS. This was the biggest risk to their security until the True Spies program. There must have been extensive internal inquiry. Clark must have been asked how it was that he came to be rumbled, and his account must have been vigorously examined. Bearing in mind that Craft was aware that people did talk all the time, and the SDS was much more open than Special Branch, they must have asked other officers what they knew. Clark told several officers that 2 sexual relationships had led to his compromise. At least 2 officers gave evidence about that account in the closed hearings. One of them gave a character reference for Craft, unable to believe that he would have known. Another believed that it was generally well known among the existing SDS officers, including at least some of the managers. The last would have been consistent with the Graham Coates account of wider managerial knowledge. HN126 Paul Gray confirmed when he joined the SDS just 1 year after Clark's exfiltration, the unearthing of the death certificate was very much in the minds of all officers when they joined the squad, and that he was aware that the security breach was said to have come about because Clark had an affair with an activist. A further strong indicator of wider managerial knowledge of the sexual relationships leading to the compromise comes from the method of Clark's exfiltration. Commander Watts urged that Clark's withdrawal must be under suitable cover, i.e., using appropriate methods to ensure that his tracks were covered. A key feature of that cover was Clark sending a note to one of the women that he'd had a relationship with, giving a false explanation as to why he had suddenly left. There was no exploration of that with Craft, despite his close involvement in exfiltration tactics. The documentary evidence conclusively demonstrates that Clark was not a maverick officer acting in isolation. A conclusion that this letter was unauthorized and sent without managerial knowledge would be as suspect as a conclusion that his anti-democratic activity was similarly unknown and unapproved. The Rick Clark letter was not an outpouring of honesty, revealing his true status and expressing his heartfelt regret. It was a tactic designed to reinforce the lie underlining the exfiltration, and therefore to prevent further inquiry from activists. It was part of Clark's suitable cover. Ultimately, the cover worked, of course, despite what Craft referred to as the ingenuity of the sinister big flame. Clark was not publicly uncovered as an SDS officer. The letter-writing tactic lived on. In the postcard sent to Madeline by Vincent Harvey, and the many, many letters that were sent to the victims of undercover officers thereafter, in the circumstances of the Clark compromise, that letter is the evidence that breaks through the thin line from an inevitable risk of sexual relationships into definitive knowledge of them. The Rick Clark deployment is indeed remarkable. On a personal level, it demonstrates the extent to which the SDS were prepared to use people to get into their homes, to deceive and sexually exploit them. On a political level, it proves the lie that is the public order of justification. There was none It proves the lie that a subversive was anyone other than someone who was opposed to state interests. In this case, the single issue of demilitarization. It demonstrates that SDS deployments were being used for far more than simply intelligence gathering. And finally, it shows who was pulling strings. Part 2, masters and servants. Both Kraft and McIntosh were unwilling to assist with the extent of their liaison with the security services during their time as managers. Kraft said that he did not have much communication with the security service whilst on the SDS. When MI5 wrote to him to convey their gratitude for the flow of information he was sending them on the activities of the SWP, there was no formality. Not only was Kraft on first name terms with MI5, they used the diminutive of his first name, Jeff. But Kraft does not remember going to the party that MI5 threw for the SDS, nor does he remember taking DI Pride to meet MI5 and introduce them to him. Nor does he remember being specifically called to a meeting with MI5 to be informed that the existence of the SDS was widely known amongst regional special branches. McIntosh was also very reluctant to accept SDS engagement with the security services, despite MI5 describing his last visit to them as routine. Whether they remember them or not, SDS engagement with the security service was increasing steadily from 1972, at the same time as the public order ultimate defense line for deployments was decreasing. Roy Creamer described 80%, perhaps more, of C Squad's work as being for MI5. It was the bread and butter work of most C Squad officers. That figure would be an underestimate on the face of the documents disclosed to the inquiry, where reports dealing with public order are few and far between. Creamer's account that the relationship between C Squad and the security service is best described as master-servant. Security service was the master, is borne out by the MI5 briefings, which the SDS were very ready to accept. The primary objective was not public order, as Mr. Kraft stated. It was the service. MI5 requests for infiltrations into the Troops Out movement and for high-grade political intelligence, particularly on the SWP. The ultimate defense line, the National Front. In our last opening statement, we addressed the 6 obvious ways in which the Metropolitan Police could have improved policing and eliminated the risk of public disorder between fascists and those who opposed them. Had those methods been adopted, the disorder at Red Lion Square, Southall and Lewisham would not have happened. Without those events, the Metropolitan Police would have lost their ultimate defense line for rationalizing their infiltration and surveillance of the Socialist Workers' Party. There is no evidence of any intelligence from the SDS impacting on the policing of those demonstrations. Recent disclosure to the inquiry has shown the one piece of information reliably thought to have come from the SDS in respect of Lewisham actually came from a press release from the Counter Demonstrations Ad Hoc Organizing Committee. That press release was the basis of the special branch threat assessment that the Home Office requested. The only solely SDS intelligence that made it into the threat assessment was the possibility that smoke bombs, flour, paint, and eggs might be used. At Southall, the disorder and violence was not only predicted by the police, but in reality, pre-planned by them. Undercover officers were warned off attending to avoid the police violence that ultimately killed Blair Peach. That government did not need the SDS to tell them there was going to be trouble at Red Lion Square, Southall, or Lewisham. The law of the land may well have entitled the National Front to make use of those places at the time, but this was a fascist organization with its roots in the party that supported Hitler's rise to power and the genocidal violence that followed. It was staging deliberately intimidating marches in minority communities. The genocidal violence was fresh in the memories of the sons and daughters of those who'd fought against it. It was even more fresh in the memories of the communities who faced that violence day after day on the streets and in their businesses and homes. The violence was so extreme that it was apparently the basis for the high-level policy decision that stopped the SDS from infiltrating the National Front. Special Branch were too frightened of violent crime to infiltrate the National Front. Yet the people who were suffering that violence were expected to be silent and tolerate the National Front marching in their hundreds through their communities. It was obvious that those communities should have been listened to, and the marches should have been banned. Detective Inspector Roy Creamer felt so strongly the Lewisham March should have been banned that he refused to do the Special Branch threat assessment. Even the Daily Express and Sun newspapers called for the National Front March to be banned. Inevitably, the people of those communities and those that supported them were not going to let the fascists pass. Those three demonstrations had become the ultimate defense line for the Metropolitan Police when trying to justify the infiltrations of the Socialist Workers' Party. It was the focus of the state's Rule 10 questions of Lindsay German, underpinning the theatrical repetition of the word overthrow. There is no Metropolitan Police acknowledgement of expulsions of squadists or the policies of discipline stewarding that the undercover officers themselves were sometimes involved in. There is no acknowledgement of the contemporary police recognition that the Socialist Workers' Party does not get involved in violence as an organization. Of course, there's no reference to the community, campaigning and political work the Marxist left did to counteract the fascist threat. There is certainly no acknowledgement that the threat of the National Front only finally subsided because the Anti-Nazi League held firm against them. The National Front had the destruction of any form of democracy as a primary intention. Their action throughout the Tranche 1 period was a clear threat to public order. It was also politically violent. They were following the Nazi playbook from the early 1930s by attempting to dominate and control the streets. Fascist activity therefore fell within Special Branch's remit. However, it was defined from the 1967 tasking and the Denning definition to the 1970, 72, and 84 adaptations, all of which we deal with below. The lack of SDS interest in fascists was doubtless in part due to fear. The institutionalized racism at the Metropolitan Police inevitably also played a part. The racist language used in many of the SDS reports firmly indicates a mindset that was shared by the National Front. Infiltrations of fascists that generated the scale of personal data that was obtained on the left would have caused such vetting problems for the Metropolitan Police, they would have struggled to fill their own ranks. But the cabinet disclosure points to a far more significant rationale for the lack of SDS infiltration of fascists. They were anti-trade union. Fascists had no interest in furthering their aims to an industrial context. Following the successful strikes of the miners, dockers, and building workers in 1972, the government's primary focus in relation to intelligence gathering was on trade unions and industry. The Socialist Workers' Party and militant trade unionists campaigned for better wages and against national wage restraint, unsafe working conditions, unemployment, and poverty. Ultimately, those campaigns led into national actions against wage restraint and restriction of trade union organizations. This inevitably impacted on the concerns of big industry and national government. Subversives. In our opening statement to the last phase of the inquiry, we undertook an analysis of the way in which the state shifted the role of the Metropolitan Police away from policing duties into political policing duties. We emphasized the starting point in 1967 that special branch officers were tasked with the preventions of crimes directed against the state. A clear task, entirely consistent with the established principles of policing. That was followed by the shift in 1970 with new terms of reference to defending the realm from actions of persons and organizations which may be judged to be subversive of the security of the state. This was a job description taken directly from the Security Service Directive of 1952 from the then Home Secretary, David Maxwell Fyfe. The shift was accompanied by a definition of subversive behavior that was intention specific and designed to be loose and capable of wide interpretation. Broadly speaking, any organization or individual whose purpose is the undermining or overthrow of the established democratic order. Those terms of reference were classified, confidential, and never released to the public. The emphasis of potentially subversive organizations and individuals could at least to some extent be tempered by the careful application of the Denning definition of subversion. Under that very public definition, actions were only subversive if they were unlawful. A chief constable concerned with real policing could apply that definition. If action was not unlawful, it could not be subversive. Crucially, the public perspective was that it was MI5 who were tasked with dealing with subversives in defense of the realm against those breaking the law. In 1972, MI5 redefined the concept. Subversion became activities threatening the safety or well-being of the state and intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial, or violent means. That definition was given some forced legitimacy in 1975 when the Security Service briefed it for adoption by the House of Lords, branding it the Harris definition, a misnomer for what was in reality the MI5 definition. Importantly, that public rebranding included reassurances the definition only applied to those who broke the law, because the freedom to join together to express and further views was fundamental to our democratic traditions. People could sleep easily, secure in the knowledge that what was happening in the United Kingdom was so very different to what was happening with the Stasi in East Germany. Later, in 1979, Leon Brittan attempted to calm concerns about a rampant special branch by stressing a strict application of the MI5 definition. Before they could be called subversive, a person or group had to have a desire to overthrow that state and be an actual threat to the state. Like Lord Harris, Brittan stressed that special branch was concerned with offences against the security of the state, implicitly equating subversion with terrorism, thereby reinforcing the fallacy for the consumption of the public that in Britain, police only dealt with crime. This was retrospective window dressing and a cover-up. There had been no strict application, and neither would there be. The state was fully conscious that the reality did not match the facade. It was appropriately Orwellian that the delayed special branch guidelines were finally published by the Thatcher government in 1984. Those guidelines were carefully constructed to continue with the deception by once again implicitly equating subversion with terrorism, at least as far as the public were concerned. The confidential correspondence accompanying the guidelines made it clear that the MI5 definition had never been read to include an actual threat to the state. The Home Office assured every chief constable that an organization currently operating within the law may nevertheless be subversive because its long-term aims satisfy the definition. Crucially, the guidelines were widely drafted with the clear but secret intention of enabling the police to continue to target those who were not engaged in subversion as long as they may become subversive in the future. In other words, those who were potential subversive. The truth is that the words, broadly speaking, may, undermine, well-being, political, industrial, operating within the law, and long-term, enabled the Metropolitan Police to be as flexible and intrusive as MI5 and government wanted them to be. Back in 1975, and importantly for our call participants, the very moment that Lord Harris was releasing the MI5 definition, Rick Clark was engaged in inveigling his way to Richard Chesham's home, the hierarchy of the Troops Out movement, and Mary's bed. Government connivance. Successive governments were well aware there was no actual threat to the state. In January 1969, the Official Committee on Subversion at Home was established on the direction of the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. It was composed of key government departments and immediately concluded that at no time were the aims of subversives, as they were then defined, within measurable distance of attainment. Instead, the focus of the committee was mainly on industrial issues and trade unions. Their concern, more often than not, was about the size of recent wage settlements and the increase in their frequency. It's telling that a committee specifically designed to deal with subversion spent much of their time worrying about people who were dedicated to improving standards of living. The Wilson government, nevertheless, encouraged the extension of intelligence gathering activity and the existing intimate relations between the security services and special branch. That government was fully aware that those intimate relations included the SDS and the work they were doing. The SDS and its continuation had been raised in discussion as at the Subversion at Home Committee in 1969, in the presence of representatives from the main government ministries, many of whom remained in the group, or its various incarnations over the following years. It is unrealistic to suggest that interdepartmental knowledge of the SDS's existence was restricted to the individuals present or was forgotten without question over the following years. The government was also aware that the security service were reluctant to use their resources to investigate the behavior of individuals who, however politically repugnant and socially objectionable they may be, are not seeking to overthrow the established constitution by extra political means. The solution to that conundrum was to expand the role of special branches. One of the last acts of the Wilson government, just 4 days before the 1970 general election, was the introduction of the 1970 Special Branch Terms of Reference, which made the relationship with MI5 and the SDS ever more intimate. In March 1972, a Security Service report sent to the Prime Minister, Edward Heath, concluded that troublesome though these groups are, they do not constitute anything in the nature of an organized conspiracy against the state. The following month, a letter from the Cabinet Office to the Prime Minister expressed the view that there was no genuinely subversive threat to society. Instead, there was a pervasive climate of opinion, which is opposed in principle to most forms of established authority, not necessarily a conscious and organized threat. That letter concerned a ministerial meeting instigated by the Prime Minister himself, for consideration to be given to the question of subversive activity in society, particularly in the industrial context. The nation's ruling elite attended. Home Secretary, Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary, Secretary of State for Defense, Lord President, Secretary of State for Employment. The Cabinet Office raised two areas for consideration. First, as there was no subversive threat to the security of the state, MI5 were limited in the help they could offer. So could MI5 be persuaded to adopt a more aggressive approach? Secondly, could the government respond to the reluctant conclusion that there was no threat with pervasive, oblique, and unattributable action, sometimes supplemented by more covert forms of activity? The conundrum was the same as that faced by the Wilson government 2 years before. The response this time was to change the definition of subversion. The MI5 definition, combined with the 1970 terms of reference, ensured that Special Branch, and in particular the SDS, would be doing MI5's dirty work for them, pervasively, obliquely, covertly, and of course, unattributably. By August 1972, the slightly renamed Group on Subversion in Public Life, SPL, was formed to improve the coordination of intelligence on the redefined concept of subversion. Its formation was directed by the Prime Minister, Edward Heath. It included the same departments of state as its predecessor. But for the first time, in recognition of the change in role provided by the new definition of subversion, it also included the Metropolitan Police Special Branch. The first Special Branch attendee at SPL meetings was Deputy Assistant Commissioner Gilbert. He was promptly informed of the new definition, including the brand new emphasis on the political and industrial. The SDS were not being tasked with infiltrating organizations to counter a genuine threat to the state. They were being tasked to infiltrate in order to counter opinion, be it political opinion or industrial opinion. The role of the SPL was to supervise and direct the collection of intelligence, particularly in industry. The chairman was Sir James Waddell. In case there's any doubt about the origin of the intelligence that was being collected, the oversight of the SDS annual reports and the decision to continue funding them was signed off in 1969, 1971, 1972, and 1974 by Sir James Waddell. Government knowledge of the SDS role in gathering that intelligence is graphically illustrated by an MI5 policy note from December 1972. Those who attended the Waddell Group meetings knew that Special Branch and MI5 were under increasing pressure from Whitehall for more and more detailed information about subversive influence in trades unions. They knew that Special Branch and MI5 were being pressured to increase agent coverage of industrial affairs, particularly in the metropolitan area. What was needed was long-term agent penetration of subversive groups active in the unions, rather than casual informed sources. Waddell's continued authorization of the SDS guaranteed that long-term penetration. That policy note made it clear that it was not only the SDS who used long-term undercover officers. Provincial forces also had some success in that field. Regional police forces not only knew of the existence of the SDS, but were using the same method from at least 1972. That's of particular importance for the infiltrations of the constituency office of the former Member of Parliament, Dave Nellist, by the West Midlands Police. Prime Minister Edward Heath attached particular importance to ministers receiving comprehensive reviews at regular intervals. The existence and the work of the SPL was to be regarded as entirely secret. It's little wonder that the SDS repeatedly reassured the Home Office of their awareness of the political sensitivity of their existence, as well as their computer age compliance, security. The close association between the SPL and the SDS continued after Edward Heath's government in 1970. After Edward Heath's government, 1975, Sir James Waddell was succeeded as chair by Robert Armstrong, who signed off the SDS annual reports in 1976 and 1977. Special branch retained membership of the SPL group. The peculiar sensitivity of the subject and Prime Minister Wilson's close interest in it ensured that it remained classified as top secret. We've not been provided with the SPL documents that cover Wilson's government, nor that of James Callaghan, who'd been the Home Secretary, who both co-created the SDS in 1969 and oversaw the introduction of the 1970 terms of reference. The inquiry has seen them. And then the limited gist evidence that we have had disclosed confirms that DAC Gilbert consistently attended the SPL meetings from March 1974 to June 1977, often with James Waddell chairing. Special branch senior officers with responsibility for the SDS were recipients of the SPL reports and minutes. The inquiry is not in possession of any documentation from the group between 1979 and 1982, although it clearly remained operational. However, in December 1979, the Security Service rebuffed any discussion about amendments to the special branch terms of reference by arguing that the then Home Secretary, William Whitelaw, had no doubts about the work being carried out by special branches, including the work for MI5. Whitelaw was de facto Deputy Prime Minister to Margaret Thatcher. Whitelaw's successor, Leon Brittenell, had a very strong interest in the 1984 Special Branch Guidelines. His role in both their drafting and the tactical considerations surrounding their disclosure to the Home Affairs Select Committee suggests that the appetite for intelligence or potential subversives has certainly not declined. The Security Service had repeatedly vetoed any attempts to amend the 1970 Special Branch Terms of Reference, and the Home Office had delayed consideration because there had been no public pressure in respect to Special Branch in the early 1980s. That changed in early 1984 when a working party of the police panel of the Association of Metropolitan Authorities started asking awkward questions about special branch conduct. Chief counsels became increasingly nervous. The pressure was on, and work on the guidelines commenced. The key difference between the 1970 terms and the 1984 replacement was the section on the special branch relationship with MI5. The 1970 terms read, in consultation with the Security Service to collect, process, and record information about subversive or potentially subversive organizations or individuals. In practice, as we've heard from almost every officer, that meant hoovering up every possible piece of information about anyone who so much as brought a copy of the Socialist Worker newspaper. The 1984 terms read, a special branch provides information about extremists and terrorist groups to the Security Service. The 1984 terms draw attention away from the wholesale collecting and recording of personal information and distracts with the word provides, as if to suggest that intelligence was just the byproduct of other work, a line that SDS witnesses have been trying unpersuasively to hold firm on. Importantly, it hides the words potentially subversive and instead suggests that only extremists who are equated with terrorists had their information passed on. It's extraordinarily dishonest subterfuge to try to hide 14 years of sinister persecution of harmless citizens for political reasons and nefarious activity conducted for their masters at MI5. The reality was very different. At the time, Special Branch Records Division held files of over 1 million individuals. When the guidelines were sent to chief constables, they were accompanied by a confidential covering letter. Paragraph 5 of that letter had been specifically included by the Security Service and included widening of the subversion definition to include long-term aims applicable to those who may become subversive in the future. Paragraph 7 dropped any mention of threat at all for special branch officers deciding whether militant trade unionism constituted subversion. The Home Office, Security Services and Police connived to ensure that those engaged in law-abiding non-violent activities could continue to be infiltrated. We asked the inquiry to be conscious of this all-pervading duplicity when engaging with government about their authorization and knowledge of the SDS. Counter-subversion and anti-democratic assistance. The acknowledged lack of any subversive threat, coupled with the expansion of special branch intelligence gathering capability, raises an obvious question. To what use was the SD intelligence put? It's been a key feature of the SDS evidence that first they gathered everything they could, and secondly, they never received complaints about the intelligence they were gathering. They generated vast amounts for the benefit of their customers, many of whom have been the subject of redactions. What is clear from the Cabinet Office disclosure is that the various interdepartmental groups in government were customers, be they direct as a result of special branch membership of those groups from 1972, or circulated via the security service as a product of their intimate relationship. The purpose of these groups was not simply to gather intelligence, but to use it for what they called counter-subversion. Bearing in mind the lack of any threat, the organizations targeted and the methods adopted, counter-subversive activity would be more appropriately termed anti-democratic activity. That activity took a number of different forms, many of which are mirrored in the deployments of undercover officers. Disruption. It was widely recognized in government that internal quarrels and dissent were a great disabling factor for political groups. In August 1968, the Official Committee on Communism Home Working Group on Countermeasures held a meeting in respect to the upcoming October demonstration. The first two main points of discussion were a recognition of dissension within the organizing committee, and then a stated aim to exploit that dissent. The object should be to allow it to be a demonstrable failure by encouraging the process of disruption among the organizers and thus minimizing its chances of success. Bearing in mind the primacy of that aim in the discussion, there must have been additional consideration on the methods that can be used to achieve it. What's the best way of encouraging disruption in a group and minimizing its chances of success? The participants in that meeting, like those that followed, including representatives of the Cabinet Office, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Home Office, Departments of Education and Employment, and of course the Security Service, all united in their aim of encouraging disruption. The SDS had been founded in the preceding month. The chances of undercover officers having a disruptive impact on the organizers, i.e. those at the higher levels of the organizations involved, were limited by the short time available before the demonstration. However, the potential must have been noted. The key ministerial representatives at that 1968 meeting were also present at the meeting of the Subversion at Home Committee the following year, in which the continuation of the SDS was discussed. Sir Bert Tren, Richard Thistlethwaite from MI5, John Tyrer from the Foreign Office, David Heaton as Secretary, and of course the Home Office representative, Sir James Waddell. The growing potential that came with longer deployments and deeper infiltrations cannot fail to have been noticed by individuals who have been specifically tasked to counter subversion. There may not be evidence of disruption being caused by undercover officers in 1968, but there is the clearest possible evidence of disruption being caused in 1975 and 1976 by Rick Clark's deployment into the Troop Site movement. The paper trail for that deployment leads to the inescapable conclusion that the disruption was known and approved of by special branch management and the security service. At the time of Clark's deployment, Commander Rollo Watts and Matt Roger were on the recipient lists of the SPL reports and minutes, and DAC Gilbert was a frequent attendee at the meetings. The focus of the inquiry so far has been on SDS intelligence gathering. However, since at least 1972, the Metropolitan Police Special Branch was directly involved via the SPL with those involved in using intelligence for counter-subversion. Further, and very importantly, at some point between 1970 and 1984, the general remit of the Special Branch in respect to subversion changed. In 1970, Special Branch was tasked with gathering intelligence from the Security Service. By 1984, the tasking was widened to include not only intelligence gathering, but also assistance. The Clark deployment stands out as a demonstrative example of assistance in counter-subversion by disruption and destabilization. There is nothing comparable in any of the other undercover deployments in Tranche 1. It may be that as an overconfident deployment that nearly ended in disaster for everyone, from the SDS up to government, a decision was taken to tone down that kind of activity. It may simply be that the example stood out because the Troops Out movement as an umbrella organization was an easier target for disruption than others. The larger Democratic Centralist Socialist Workers' Party, for example, would have been a much harder target. The Clark deployment is not the only example of assistance. Another much more proximate to the 1984 guideline drafting is the Security Service liaison note, detailing a meeting between MI5 and Chief Inspector Short of the SDS in 1983. MI5 passed on a brief to the SDS on instructions in respect to the Socialist Workers' Party. Short informed MI5 that Phil Cooper, HN 155, who had infiltrated the Socialist Workers' Party headquarters, is brewing a row at HQ. That line, though short, is important. First, it is directly indicative of assistance rather than intelligence gathering. Secondly, it is an example of disruptive assistance aimed at the SWP. Thirdly, it was relevant enough to the SDS-MI5 relationship for a chief inspector to refer to it and MI5 to note and record it. Fourthly, the fact that the row was brewing demonstrates that it was an ongoing action. The reference to it and noting of it are plainly indicative of approval. Finally, for a chief inspector to know of the disruptive assistance, it must have been reported to him. The lack of additional supporting evidence does not mean it did not happen. It shows that the reports have not been disclosed by the Metropolitan Police or MI5. The best way to ensure that the inquiry concludes that there is no evidence of an activity or tactic is to provide no evidence of it. Membership, propaganda, and electoral interference. It's no coincidence that Special Branch membership of the Committee on Subversion and Public Life immediately followed the introduction of the MI5 definition and its focus on political and industrial activity. The very first report that Special Branch received from the SPL was titled "The Impact of Subversive Groups on Trade Union Activity." It was sent to Deputy Assistant Commissioner Gilbert, as well as a number of other recipients who were specifically tasked with counter-subversion via their committee memberships. A significant focus from the perspective of Special Branch in the SDS was on the Socialist Workers' Party. In particular, their main objective to attract new recruits by the virulence of their propaganda. This was followed by some detail on the circulation and influence of the Socialist Worker newspaper, which contributed to the propagation of militant attitudes in industry generally. The emphasis was on the first, the ability of the Socialist Workers' Party to increase its membership, and secondly, the quality and effectiveness of its media. The membership figures of the Socialist Workers' Party were a constant fixation of government. Equally, the media more generally was a fascination for the various counter-subversion groups. The Cabinet Office documents detail a number of examples of government manipulation of the mainstream media to further its ends. It's not a surprise that government was so fixated. The Socialist Workers' Party were not advocating a putsch, they were advocating a process of heightening awareness and winning people over to try to achieve a more democratic society. A significant part of that campaigning work in and around 1972 was in industry, was proving very effective. The study of the range of possible counter-subversion measures must have included consideration of methods to limit party membership and newspaper circulation. It's no coincidence that post-1972, a large number of the many SDS officers who infiltrated the Socialist Workers' Party took positions as either membership secretaries or newspaper organizers. The officer tendencies to downplay these roles as menial are in conflict with the government's preoccupation. They were key roles. The role of the membership secretary in an organization is not to simply record membership, but to engage with and encourage that membership. The role of the paper organization in the Socialist Workers' Party was to promote the sales of the newspaper, which was the foundation on which the party was built. It's a very, very central role. The SDS taking positions of responsibility within organizations fitted the government requirement for pervasive, oblique, and unattributable action. It is self-evident that it would be destabilizing and anti-democratic, whether it led to orchestrated disruption or simply put an uncommitted individual in a role that would have been more productively taken by someone else. The latter was consistent with the government view that low-level counteraction was often effective. Trade unions. The main concern in Special Branch's first SPL briefing was the extent to which the influence and standing of many right-wing trade union leaders had been reduced. It became a general swing in major unions away from moderate or right-wing policies and the difficulties that national officials were having controlling shop stewards and the wider trade union membership. The government problem was with trade union militancy and the challenge it raised to their social policy and state legislation. Government's clear aim was to put an end to it. Secret counter-subversion documents boasted about the success that government had had in 1971, included in influencing certain key trade union elections. But the successful strike action of 1972 had shown that electoral interference in the trade union was not enough. The rank and file and unofficial factory-based leadership were immune to it. The government had difficulty putting agents directly onto the shop floor. Certain parliamentarians and trade unionists were very alive to the threat. Strike actions, sit-ins, and unwillingness to negotiate were not unlawful. But the extension of special branch powers via the industrial addition to the subversion definition allowed for widespread indirect infiltration and monitoring of the trade union rank and file. Any organization MI5 said was potentially subversive could be infiltrated. And so any campaign designed to challenge government policy could be dealt with as if it were designed to overthrow the state. Militant trade unionism was the target behind the pretense of dealing with subversion. The specific exclusion of any subversive threat in relation to infiltrations of militant trade unionism in the 1984 guidelines cannot have been an accident of drafting. It was simply a continuation of what had been happening since 1972. The Socialist Workers' Party's campaign, such as the Rank and File Organizing Committee and the Right to Work campaign, were, in the words of the SDS themselves, to fight for the rights of trade unions, individuals, and groups of workers against the oppression of management and government, in particular at this time of high unemployment and anti-union legislation. The aim, again, in the SDS's own words, was for pressure to be brought to bear against management and government when fighting short-term working redundancies and unemployment, or demanding improved pay and or conditions. That was exactly what government was worried about, and their various groups were designed to deal with. And that was why the Socialist Workers' Party was infiltrated at the headquarters level on the direct orders of MI5, and why the Right to Work campaign was specifically targeted. Colin Clark and Phil Cooper harvested intelligence on the organizational structure of the Socialist Workers' Party, its administration, finances, and membership. They use their attendance at almost every national delegate conference and annual Skegness rally from 1977 to 83 to gather and capture personal details of hundreds of attendees. They use their access to the party headquarters and computer system to steal the organization's data and the data of its members, even going so far as controlling finances as ordered by MI5. So we've got a few more pages to go. I'm aware that we're approaching 1 o'clock. Can I be allowed to finish it off? Or?
Of course.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And I apologize to everyone for delaying their lunch. Thank you, sir. Blacklisting. The focus of all the reporting was employment, education, and trade union related. When government wrings its hands about trade union militancy and orders positive counter action against key subversive groups and individuals, what possible explanation is there for the repeated, targeted, and obsessive harvesting of that specific information? The ultimate anti-democratic countermeasure is blacklisting. We dealt with the evidence on this topic extensively in our last opening statement. Lindsay German was questioned by counsel to the inquiry on the apparent inconsistency between the Socialist Workers' Party being an open organization and the need for security measures at the 1978 National Delegates Conference. It was a state-led line of questioning designed to suggest that there was something sinister about the party taking security measures. It was somewhat ridiculous, bearing in mind that the state had comprehensively infiltrated the conference and was fully aware there was nothing remotely sinister going on. The principal reason for the security was fear of the threat of blacklisting. By the late 1970s, it was common knowledge that people were being sacked and could not find work because of their political opinions. Blacklisting was a countermeasure. Not only did it take politically active people out of the workplace, it made people afraid to be politically active or militant, there or indeed anywhere else. We recognize the step in the right direction that counsel to the inquiry has taken on this topic, but the conclusions do not go far enough on a considered analysis of the evidence and the inferences that can be drawn from it. There is no doubt that SDS intelligence reports were used for vetting purposes. The evidence for the managing officers was clear on the vetting value to MI5 of the SDS reporting. Vetting did not apply to work in government departments, did not only apply to work in government departments, it also applied to public corporations, List X firms, private corporations engaged on government security contracts. The list of those private corporations was extensive and they covered all sectors of the economy. There is no doubt SDS reports were used for blacklisting. Government accepted and excused the inevitability of it. Employers pleaded for intelligence, and when a special branch officer is seeking help from an employer or from a union official, is asking a good deal to expect him to insist invariably it is engaged in a one-way traffic. It should not be asking a good deal to expect a police officer to abide by the criminal law on bribery and corruption. It's interesting that Sir James Waddell thought that it was, and that he was prepared to share that view so openly with the Home Secretary himself. Unsurprising, the government's own approach was consistently duplicitous. The rules may prevent it, but where there was overt evidence that a subversive employee was likely to change the scene of his operations, it was possible to ensure that this was given enough unofficial publicity to serve as an adequate warning to firms who might be at risk. The government simply directed employers to non-official organizations such as the Economic League or Industrial Research and Information Services Limited, IRIS. IRIS was the unofficial body the government's counter-subversion groups to liaise with to influence trade union elections. They were all working hand in glove. The SDS reporting on the national membership and trade union affiliations of the Socialist Workers' Party was ordered by the Security Service. The details were provided by the Security Service, and from there was no limit on the onward dissemination. Conclusion. In the early 1970s, There was a fundamental change in what the SDS was to be and what it was expected to deliver. It would no longer be a case of an officer sitting at the back of a public meeting and taking notes. It was a squad. It was driven to be deep undercover, to draft reports on anything and everything. Officers were assigned to organizations for 4 to 5 years, using the names of dead children to establish their legend. It was a squad that would report extensively on trade unionists, socialists, anti-apartheid activists, communists, and those who wanted troops out of Ireland. Officers such as Rick Clark not only entered an organization, he instigated and helped establish a branch of that organization, the Troops Out movement. Following the new direction of what was expected of an SDS officer, he then fought his way to the top of the movement. Along the way, he was happy to use people as stepping stones. He invaded people's lives and used sex as a tactic to build his credibility. He abused friendships and undermined activists who were genuinely committed to the cause. Rick Clark was not a rogue officer. He was a foot soldier to the new strategy. His activities were understood, known, and crucially directed. They became a blueprint for officers as they joined campaigns and political parties and moved their way to positions of influence. Rick Clark is important to this inquiry as an example of what was to come from the early 1970s. He represented the new strategy of not just the SDS, but the British establishment, an establishment that had already opened 1 million files on its citizens. The disclosure we have reviewed demonstrates that political policing was organized on a scale that should shock everyone, not just because of what was being done, but the impact it had on the lives of ordinary people. It was surveillance and spying on an industrial scale. The new strategy was built on deep infiltration of campaigns and political parties by SDS officers, funded and directed by a cabal of state institutions, from special branches to the security services, from the Home Office to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. It included a cast of senior civil servants and outside bodies such as the Economic League. This army of surveillance led all the way from the door of successive cabinet ministers and successive prime ministers. In their defense, the British establishment claimed to be defending democracy, but it was not a defense of democracy. It was the undermining of democracy in defense of the establishment. So thank you very much for allowing us to finish.
Thank you for finishing within a reasonable time, even though not to the letter of the mid-second of the time that you were originally allocated.
Thank you very much.
I'm grateful to you for completing your submission with the efficiency that you have.
Thank you.
We will now resume, we'll now pause and resume at 2 o'clock for further submissions, beginning with those of Mr. Greenall. Thank you.